July 1st, the first day of the holidays, was the day new Otherworld knowledge refreshed, and it was also the day Dumbledore decided to close the gate leading to the world of death. Ding! Talent Otherworld knowledge triggered. Discovered. Nether Scroll number 68. Purple. Nether Scroll number 68 Purple was a golden parchment recovered by the Netherese in the ruins of Aravandar. There were 2 sets of Nether Scrolls, 50 scrolls in each set, 100 in total. The Nether Scrolls had formed the foundation of modern magical theory in Faerun. Since the rise of Netheril, any wizard who had mastered the arcane had taken knowledge from those scrolls. Much of that knowledge had become common lore among sorcerers, but the Nether Scrolls still held a vast amount of material of immense value. Reading a single Nether Scroll could grant a profound comprehension of the arcane. Anyone who read one immediately gained a level in their chosen arcane spellcasting class. Mortal minds had their limits, of course. Even if someone managed to gather all the scrolls, few could digest the 9th without breaking, and weaker minds went mad long before the 5th. The content of Nether Scroll number 68 was titled Arcane Discourse, Artifact Creation, Unknown. It was widely believed to teach methods of creating artifacts. The exchange cost was 7,833 experience points, a staggering price for a purple quality knowledge item. Ted did not hesitate. After the exchange, a torrent of silver-white runes flowed through his mind like liquid. Even with his modest intelligence of 13, perception of 15, and spirit of 23, he felt dizzy after only a short time. The knowledge was dense and abstruse. Much of it was vague and would require time to assimilate. Yet the scroll granted immediate benefits: intelligence +3, perception +2, spirit +1, and an extra 100,000 experience. That experience was enormous. Ted thought about how much effort it would normally take to earn that much, literally months of killing monsters or grinding player interactions in the virtual world he had designed. The Nether Scroll's combination of specialized knowledge, 5 free attribute points, and a huge lump of experience, all for under 8,000 experience, was a godsend. A new skill appeared in his repertoire as well: Artifact Creation, Level 1. Ted felt elated. With Dumbledore preparing to go offline, he needed every advantage he could get. Ted calculated. With accrued experience and the new 100,000 points, he now had 485,000 experience to spend. With a minus 10% talent reduction, wizard levels required: 1718, 153,000, 1819, 171,000, 1920, 190,000, total 462,600. He could push his wizard class straight to the cap in one go. Breaking through to level 21 and into true legend would be beyond the system. That path had to be found another way. But for now, level up. System: upgrade my wizard class, 3 levels in a row. Ding! Your wizard class has reached level 18. You have gained 1 attribute point, 1 skill point. Ding! Your wizard class has reached level 19. You have gained 1 attribute point, 1 skill point. Ding! Your wizard class has reached level 20. You have gained 1 attribute point, 1 skill point, and 1 talent card draw opportunity. He put the 3 attribute points into intelligence, raising his bare intelligence to 19, plus an additional +2 from his spirit crystal servant. Even with that, Ted felt the strain of digesting high-tier otherworld knowledge. Higher quality knowledge was harder to absorb, and low starting intelligence made it taxing. He spent his 3 skill points all on the new artifact creation skill. The talent draw then presented 3 cards in his mind. The first was orange bordered, Magic Body Orange. Your body gradually sheds mortal flesh and blood, becoming composed of magic. Magic becomes your essence. Your attributes are bolstered by your total magical reserves. Vital point vulnerabilities and mortal weaknesses disappear. +3 magic resistance, +7 poison resistance, gain resistance to grievous injury, fatal wounds, and instant death effects. This was tremendous. A body made of magic whose attributes scaled with one's magic, ideal for survivability. The second card, purple bordered, felt different. Magic Torrent, purple. You begin to deepen your communion with external magic, drawing on magical tides to replenish your reserves. +2 magic can break through the level 9 limit. After activation, +3 magic temporarily can break through level 9. Although purple, Magic Torrent was potent. Magic was a wizard's foundation. Without high magic, nothing else mattered. The card even suggested a way to push beyond the conventional limit of level 9 magic, offering a path toward legend. Ted's mind raced. Magic Body's effects were based on total magic, so Magic Torrent would amplify Magic Body's power. If he could have both, the combo would be ideal: permanent body transformation plus easy access to high magic for scaling. The third card, also orange-bordered, was Magical Orin. You begin to perceive the operation of the world's rules as plainly as watching a fire. You learn to use those rules, enabling you to construct artifact-level wonders beyond mortal reach. Massive magic circles, planar gateways, and magical edifices of world-altering scale. Magical Spectacle promised the ability to observe the machinery of reality and use it to create grand constructs, the kind that turned a sight into a true wonder. Gates like the Dark Portal, planar links, or even artifacts of divine power. Normal wizards could build magic circles and wards. Ted himself had enough knowledge to create workshops and barriers from the Type Moon-derived material he'd studied. But this talent implied stepping above that, seeing the rules from higher ground and drafting designs on a scale mortals normally could not achieve. The potential was staggering. Ted felt torn. If he could choose two, he would take Magic Body and Magic Torrent and form a survivable magical core set. But if he could only pick one, Magical Spectacle had long-term potential to eclipse them all. He could not decide, and the indecision gnawed at him, like having both a sleeping dragon and a young phoenix in the same hand. He had no time to agonize. At noon, the Ideal Land's official live broadcast channel went live. All personal live stream rooms were closed for the event. Only 100 or so people had independent broadcast permission during beta. Dumbledore and Ted had agreed to broadcast everything from the start. Lord Voldemort wanted to see Dumbledore sacrifice himself to close the door, did he not? Then let him watch. The world had a right to know what had been paid for their peace: an old man's life. Let them remember this when Voldemort's shadow returned. Let them know that sacrifices were sometimes necessary and that courage existed. Dumbledore, Snape, and Ted had rehearsed the plan after learning of the prophecy. It was dangerous, and death was not something to trifle with. Voldemort needed Dumbledore gone. If Dumbledore remained to meddle from the sidelines, he would keep up guerrilla tactics, prolonging the war. Only Dumbledore's death would give them a chance to force a decisive confrontation. It was a gamble they had to take. Ted had created a mind-powered gem to safeguard Dumbledore's mind and consciousness. Snape had given Dumbledore a tube of purple potion with unknown but suggestive effects. Dumbledore himself had prepared as best he could. The art of transformation included changing the bond between life and death, but whether it would succeed was uncertain. He hoped and prepared for the worst. "From now on, it will be up to you," Dumbledore said, smoothing his robes before the mirror. He looked tidier than usual on purpose. "As you can imagine, this will be a long and arduous period." Ted's chest tightened. "Your path will be even harder than ours." Dumbledore smiled. "No, if we succeed, I will return. If I fail, then I will move on. Either way, I will have fulfilled my wish, so be ready. Perhaps it will truly fall to you." Snape's lips curled with a rare, mocking smile. "If you have that mindset, then forget it. Don't waste your old life." Dumbledore laughed, bright and full. When they stepped out in the corridor, the school was already crowded. "Professor! Dumbledore! Headmaster!" Students spotted him in his new robes and broke into tears. The corridor swelled with sobs. Even Snape, frowning, kept his anger in check. Dumbledore raised a hand. "Do not be afraid. I set out on another journey. Be brave. There is still hope." They walked to the school gates together. The live broadcast had already begun. From the moment Dumbledore left his office, viewers climbed past 500,000 and kept rising. Messages poured in: gratitude, admiration, grief. A few idiots cursed about the day's closures and were banned for a month on the spot. More offenses would mean permanent revocation of network privileges. Dumbledore looked back once and told those gathered, "This is as far as you go. Ted will accompany me. The rest of you stay." Snape remained among the crowd. Dumbledore suspected changes in Snape, signs that might surprise Voldemort, but that was for another day. Ted apparated them directly to the Swiss Ministry of Magic. From the English Highlands to Switzerland was about 1,500 kilometers. Ted transported a person with practiced ease. Dumbledore watched Swiss wizards hurrying to meet them and whispered, "You have grown stronger, Ted. You always surprise me. That eases my mind." The Swiss Minister of Magic rushed forward and took Dumbledore's hands. "Dumbledore, thank you. Please, thank you for your sacrifice." "No thanks are needed. This is my choice," Dumbledore said calmly. "Lead us, please." They reached the rim of a canyon where the gate stood. Swiss wizards had been clearing the approach for days, but undead kept rising from the pale mist. Ted led Dumbledore into the chasm. Camera snitches flew overhead, broadcasting from every angle. Undead assaulted them in wave after wave. The most powerful was a level 13 elite skeleton knight, black smoke coiling from its spear, its bones glimmering with necromancy. Ted waved his wand. A focused pulse of magic shattered the creature, and the soul fire in its skull dissipated into raw magic. Dumbledore did not lift a finger. He needed to conserve every scrap of power for what lay beyond the gate. After a tense 10 minutes, they stood before the 15-meter-high stone door. The air thrummed with concentrated death magic that corroded living flesh and disrupted the camera snitches. Ted cast a protective shell to shield the devices and keep the live feed stable. "This is as far as I go, Ted," Dumbledore said. "The rest is my journey. From here on, it may truly be up to you." Ted nodded. Dumbledore made no further speeches. He held his wand, took a steady step, and walked into the darkness of the door. He was nearly 6.5 feet tall, but before that vast portal, he seemed small. In moments, his figure disappeared into shadow. Ted waited outside the door, battling the undead that swarmed the approach, keeping the cameras clear for the world watching. An hour and a half passed. Messages in the live stream feed shifted from prayer and sorrow to anxious speculation. Could the door really be closed? What would become of Dumbledore? On one hand, people feared the end of the world. On the other, they feared for Dumbledore. Then the enormous stone slab began to close, inching down with the weight of ages. 3 minutes later, it sealed completely. Dumbledore's silhouette was gone. The ground quivered. The torrent of death magic that had flooded the canyon stilled as if its source had been snuffed. Ted exhaled and pointed his wand, converting the remaining death magic into other energies, life-sustaining forms, to prevent the valley from becoming a dead zone. It was his talent, magic conversion. Others would have found the task far harder. Because it was broadcast live, the whole world saw what had happened. Dumbledore had entered the other world, and the door had closed behind him. For many, the sight was unbearable. For others, it was a moment of bitter, necessary resolve. Lord Voldemort, who had been watching the feed with the Death Eaters, grinned until his face split. He laughed aloud, triumphant. He knew that his greatest objective had been achieved. For half a month after Dumbledore closed the door, life carried on as if nothing had changed. People wanted to believe the old wizard was still alive. It wasn't until 3:40 p.m. on January 15th that Ted, who had been reworking the omnidirectional magic web, stopped dead in his tracks, set his quill down, and walked toward the Great Hall. At the entrance, a younger student came rushing out and nearly collided with him. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but Ted put up a hand. "I know," he said. Inside the Great Hall, several students had already gathered around a crystal wrapped in a magic shield on the professor's table at the far end. The crystal had been glowing faintly for weeks. A short time before Ted arrived, the glow had gone out. No miracle followed. After clinging on for half a month, the one behind the door had finally yielded. The crystal had been set as a life detector. As long as he lived, it would remain lit. Now it was dark. In that world beyond the door, once it closed, there was no coming back. Even a legend could only hold on so long. Ted stared at the dim crystal and for a moment felt numb. Then a system prompt blinked before his eyes. "You have witnessed a great death and gained profound understanding and insight. You have acquired the talent Understanding Death read. When facing undead and instant death magic, +5 levels of magic resistance." Ted inhaled, steadied himself, and sent the message, "Dumbledore has sacrificed himself." By evening, the newspapers ran special editions. The Daily Prophet's headline read, "Dumbledore has sacrificed himself." The magic world fell briefly silent, then erupted in discussion. Over the previous fortnight, the reanimations and resurrections had been visibly diminishing. Whatever Dumbledore had done by closing the door had been working. Still, with the news that he had paid for it with his life, grief and helplessness swelled. Wizards asked themselves what came next. If this victory required the greatest of sacrifices, could they repeat it? Who else could be sacrificed? Was there a future at all? Hogwarts held a funeral the next day on the grounds between the Black Lake and the Forbidden Forest. Dumbledore had left no body, only a folded set of clothes rested in a stone coffin. The sky was leaden, and the air made the trees look like silhouettes. Everyone dressed in black. Many of the women wore veils. Teachers, students, and visiting wizards numbered in the hundreds. Ted stood at the stone coffin and read the eulogy. It was short, not a torrent of grief, because it had been written by Dumbledore himself. He had been ready. Ted set the paper down and addressed the crowd. "We are here to say farewell to Dumbledore. He has done too much for us. Now it is time for him to rest. There will be more trials ahead," as he said. "Be brave, and there is still hope." He lifted his wand. A spell shot up, slicing apart a bank of dark clouds so that a shaft of sunlight fell across the clearing. Those gathered stopped weeping and raised their wands as well, making them glow in a small bright trail as if to illuminate Dumbledore's way. After the service, Ted noticed Grindelwald standing by the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Grindelwald said nothing. He looked at Hogwarts for a long beat, gave a slow shake of his head, and left. Ted also watched Aberforth, Dumbledore's younger brother and proprietor of the Hog's Head, who had come to the funeral alone. Aberforth had once resented his brother, blaming him for many family deaths. Now the last living relative was gone, and he seemed utterly desolate, a figure as stooped and worn as Dumbledore himself. That evening in the Great Hall, conversation was cautious and hushed. The silence was heavy. Ted responded by playing a nocturne. "Now let the day slip away, so that the night may come to guard you. Velvet blue night, so silent and real, it embraces your heart and soul. The nocturne is playing. Don't cry, don't sigh, you don't need to wonder why. The night is always there, always seen. Dreamwalk with me into that night. The nocturne is playing." Life moved forward. Some left, some stayed. The music felt like a promise that those who remained must carry on. Then, at midnight on the day of the funeral, a celestial convergence occurred. Ted was on the main tower watching a massive celestial body, several times larger than the moon and glowing faintly yellow, cross the sky. It grew from a small point into a huge disk, then shrank again and vanished. The whole spectacle lasted about 50 minutes and was visible across the world. No telescope required. If you weren't legally blind, you could see it. This was not the first time such a convergence had happened. It had occurred before, and initially Muggle authorities would offer mundane explanations like a comet or an optical illusion. Now they grew weary of excuses. The convergence clearly meant the infiltration of other dimensions had deepened. A few days after the funeral, Ted woke early. It was still before dawn. The sky outside his window was a dim blue-gray. He quietly eased Hermione's arm from under the covers and slipped out of bed. McGonagall had taken over as headmistress, but many international and ministry matters needed Ted's attention, and he had to represent Dumbledore's office in a host of places. He also had to keep the Order of the Phoenix functioning. Thankfully, many members already trusted him. Even so, the workload fell heavily on someone who hadn't graduated. Ted sometimes wondered if he had stepped into a trap. Had he inherited Dumbledore's mission and its burdens? He reminded himself he had chosen to fulfill it. Seventh-year students were on the verge of leaving. Normally, many of them would already be on internships, learning life beyond school. This year, Ted called a meeting of all 6th and 7th years. "You all know how much the world has changed," he told them. "Both Muggles and Wizards will face severe trials. I want us to organize and respond proactively. Form work groups like the Ideal Land Team and the Magic Web Deployment Teams. Concentrate our strengths. Clench your 5 fingers into a fist. Use what you can to contribute." Most of the 6th and 7th years joined the Hogwarts Employment Internship Assistance Group. Ted set up. A small portion of Slytherins declined. Some came from families with Death Eater ties who had fled to Voldemort's circle in Eastern Europe. They couldn't align with Ted. Minister Bones was irritated and complained that the group undermined the ministry's influence and threatened to split spokesmanship. Ted didn't have time to placate petty territorial disputes. The world was changing too fast. His main focus was accelerating several projects, foremost the full-coverage magic web. Northern and Western Europe and much of the Mediterranean had nearly completed it. The coverage went deep enough to unfold the mirror world instantly and allow the ideal land to descend. Eastern Europe, where Death Eaters had seized territory, was impossible to work in for the moment. Ted concentrated on Africa, the Americas, and Australia instead. Strengthening his side was the only prudent course. They would handle enemy moves as they came. 2 days later, he received news that Newt, the young man who had been trapped in his mental world for more than a year, had died. Ted couldn't help but mutter, he held on too long. Newt had been reckless. If he'd been patient and developed for another couple of years, his power might have multiplied. Instead, he'd been captured and drained. From him, Ted had gained 6 strength, 8 constitution, 7 agility, and 3 perception. Newt's raw attributes had been high, strength, constitution, and agility in the 20s, perception in the teens. But his intelligence and spirit had been middling, so those didn't transfer. Newt's powers had come from drugs, modifications, and mutations. They were sudden and hard for the wielder to exploit fully. He'd also developed talents like steel body, anti-gravity flight, and laser eyes. Had he had time, he might have become a superpowered individual. Now he was gone. Ted decided the body must be preserved and studied for genes and bloodline, and if nothing else, advanced materials could be salvaged. Ted received an invitation from the International Confederation of Wizards to attend a meeting. He went, but mostly listened. The old wizards had no intention of soliciting a 17-year-old's advice, despite Dumbledore's final act of passing on his connections. In their eyes, Ted could not confront Lord Voldemort directly without decades of development. Yet Voldemort and his Death Eaters were the immediate problem. After Dumbledore closed the door, the Death Eaters had been restless. Voldemort had kept them in check. Once word spread that Dumbledore had died, the Death Eaters could no longer be restrained. They began infiltrating neighboring countries and brazenly provoking local ministries. In some places, their dominance was signaled by broomstick flyovers and messages left behind. This place is under the Dark Lord's authority. Death Eaters were swallowing regions of Eastern and Central Europe. Many fearful wizards fled overseas. The celestial convergence had also triggered new phenomena across the globe. In the Far East, Japan had the fiercest spillover, a nightly parade of demons. Outside heavily guarded districts, a curfew was effectively in place after 10 p.m. If you wandered the streets, you could meet a real monster. Stumbling into a demon market and waking up later in ruins or a wasteland might be one thing. Being eaten by a monster was another. Which fate you met depended on which monster gang controlled your neighborhood. Some gangs kept a precarious, near-human coexistence. Others were predatory. The Emperor's Circle had onmyoji, Shinto priests, monks, and demon slayers trying to maintain balance, but it wasn't enough. Monster populations were sometimes outpacing human control. In the countryside, local belief and shrine worship had revived. Small shrines were packed with offerings where people no longer felt the distant imperial protection was adequate. South Korea was also in turmoil. Folk groups, some new, some long established, mushroomed and amassed wealth and influence, sometimes exceeding official authorities. Worse, some fell into dark practices, occult cultivation and bloody sacrifices. Wizards from the region posted on the Ideal Land Forum that high-ranking officials had allegedly organized secret mass sacrifices, including reports of a ship made to sink with hundreds of graduating students aboard. Appeals for help were frantic, but from thousands of miles away, there was little that could be done. Ted's immediate response was to tweak the Magic World system. He updated in-game time so that game time ran at 1.5 times real time. For every hour in reality, an hour and a half passed in the game. That gave players more time to research, fight, and practice magic. Time magic had a fraught history. The world had once collected and destroyed time-related artifacts for a reason, but when the hornet's nest is already stinging, sometimes you take calculated risks. Europe wasn't idle either. Occult knowledge and dangerous practices began to spread openly in normal society, things like the Black Book, the Rune Skull Society, and Saturnian worship. Their origins were murky, but they contained kernels of truth that made them effective and terrifyingly toxic. One major incident involved a Muggle-triggered phenomenon that produced a citywide wave of psychiatric breakdown. Simply seeing or hearing certain information induced severe mental illness. The outbreak first swept through students and within days affected over 100,000 people in a single city. It took 300 to 400 wizards from various countries working with local authorities to clean up the fallout. The crisis lasted over a week. August arrived, and the heat was already oppressive. This year's temperatures were abnormally high, and rains came in strange, sudden bursts. Climate anomalies had begun last year and only grown worse. To some extent, the changes helped agriculture, but unfamiliar weeds had sprouted everywhere after the downpours. People kept finding strange new fruits and vegetables, some additions to the table that would have been better left uneaten. Best advice: don't eat unfamiliar fungi. Ding. Talent triggered. Otherworld knowledge, gold. Discovered. Attempt at simplified sequence potions, purple. Attempt at simplified sequence potions, purple. Sequence potions are a system in which materials with extraordinary properties are refined into potions. Consuming those potions lets a person absorb extraordinary traits and advance their life level. But the system is risky. Even without chasing godhood, becoming a transcendent and wielding extraordinary powers is inherently dangerous. A transcendent who called himself the Fool, after advancing, set about modifying and simplifying sequence potions. By sacrificing the ceiling on further advancement, he dramatically reduced the difficulty and the risk of refining, consuming, and digesting low and mid-level sequence potions. These were the simplified sequence potions. This otherworld knowledge is the Fool's experimental notes. Praise the Fool. It required 4,655 experience points to exchange. Although classed purple, the knowledge itself wasn't rare in value, its usefulness was broad. It would let many more people safely take low and mid-level sequence potions and become transcendent. It couldn't push someone to the highest tiers, only a handful of individuals could reach those levels anyway, but it could be widely applied and would benefit most people. Ted skimmed the notes. For him personally, it didn't offer much immediate gain, but for other wizards or even ordinary people, it was revolutionary. With this manual, other potion makers could produce safe sequence potions to augment themselves or grant limited special abilities. The refinement techniques were not wildly exotic. Outstanding fifth-year students should already have the requisite skills. In short, a diligent fifth-year witch or wizard with a dozen galleons and about a week's work could make a basic, simplified sequence potion. After drinking it and digesting it over roughly half a year, they could gain attribute boosts, skill improvements, maybe even a few special abilities. Ordinary people could use such potions to cross into transcendent status or to acquire magic and become wizards. Ever since Voldemort's resurrection and the escalating crossovers with other worlds, contact between the mundane world and the magic world had become common. Where once only a handful of national leaders knew of the magic world's existence, now mid-level government officials often had direct or indirect ties to magical people. Strange incidents increasingly required both special government departments and wizards to resolve. Secrets leak, and once officials had to cooperate regularly with magic, it became impossible to keep everything hidden. The ruling classes in ordinary society grew eager to turn ordinary people into wizards, or at least superhumans who could live longer and wield power. That hunger explains the craze for so-called superhuman potions in places like America. Even street gangs sold them almost as commonly as marijuana. Were American elites fools? No. The epidemic of superhuman potions was tolerated, sometimes even sponsored, because it served their ends. If becoming a wizard outright was too hard, perhaps becoming a superhuman was attainable. The side effects were enormous, but with millions taking these potions, researchers could gather data and gradually refine them. Politicians wrapped it in rhetoric about personal freedom. Companies researching such potions received funding. The military openly admitted it wanted whatever edge it could get. Increase the dose, they said. Don't ban the potions. So Ted now possessed a manual for simplified sequence potions, safe, low-risk, powerful compared to current superhuman elixirs, and cheap. If this became public, chaos was likely. Ted decided to hand the document to Snape for localization and further research. The world was changing quickly. Disasters and upheavals were coming. Power mattered, and he needed capable allies. If his students could each drink and digest such potions, their strength wouldn't literally double, but it would come close. 70 or 80 elite wizards could, together, outmatch the Ministry of Magic. There was a long way from an otherworld manuscript to a marketable product, so Snape, who had the necessary skill set, was the obvious person to task. Ted went to Snape's office and handed over the notes. Snape glanced at them and raised an eyebrow. "The Fool?" he said. "I've seen that name in that potion professor's recipe notes. They described the Fool as a very active character who's recently appeared. I didn't expect him to be tinkering with high-level potion modifications already." Snape's remark set off a train of thought in Ted about the otherworld's timeline. The notes Snape had gotten must date from when the protagonist Klein was just gaining prominence, whereas the otherworld knowledge Ted had came from a later point, perhaps when Klein was at sequence 3 or higher. What was the chronology over there? Ted couldn't make sense of it. Snape set the notes aside and said, "Yesterday the Dark Lord contacted me." "Oh?" Ted asked. He wasn't surprised that Voldemort would reach out to Snape again. Dumbledore was dead, and Voldemort had grown brazen. Snape might have been suspected in the past, but with Dumbledore gone, Voldemort had fewer doubts. "He wants to return to Britain and reclaim what's his," Snape said. "But first, other business." The other business was obvious to Ted. The Elder Wand. Voldemort already possessed the Gaunt Ring, an heirloom from Slytherin's line, embedded with a resurrection stone. He hadn't understood its significance when he was younger. After traveling and building himself up as the Dark Lord, he became interested in the legend of the Deathly Hallows, but his Horcrux strategy made that pursuit secondary. After his killing curse backfired, and he was later resurrected by the otherworld death mage Ryan, he endured terrible exploitation before he clawed his way back and got revenge. During that period, he acquired a great deal of otherworld knowledge from Ryan. He captured an otherworld orc pain mage and, by probing its soul, learned a complete magical system concerning souls and life, an earth-shattering discovery. Around the same time, he also captured a creature born of Greek myth, a ferryman of the Styx. This monster was obsessed with taking money to ferry souls. From it, Voldemort obtained insights into the afterlife, which, combined with Ryan's unfinished plans to open the door of death and transform the world, gave him an idea. He sent agents to the Department of Mysteries and stole the veil, the stone door. With that and fragments of Ryan's plan, he built his own Door of the Dead. That move forced Dumbledore into a confrontation that cost the old man his life. With Dumbledore dead, Voldemort felt unstoppable, yet he still hungered for the Elder Wand. His inquiries led to the famed wand maker Grigorovich in Germany. Voldemort's men extracted his memories and discovered that indeed Grigorovich once had the Elder Wand, but it had been taken by a young wizard. The thief turned out to be a young Grindelwald. Voldemort fumed. The legend said the Elder Wand makes its owner invincible. Grindelwald had later been defeated by Dumbledore. Voldemort would not tolerate another man being called a Dark Lord in the same world. Besides, Grindelwald's influence in Africa was growing. The Saint organization thrived there, and Ouagadougou had become a cradle for their movement. Their numbers and organization were impressive, arguably outstripping the Death Eaters in structure, charisma, and ideology. Voldemort could not let Grindelwald consolidate power, so he took his followers and went to Africa. What was Grindelwald doing then? He had been dealing with a large-scale otherworld incursion. After Dumbledore's death, celestial alignments shifted and strange phenomena surged. Most incidents were small, but this one was severe. At the foot of a mountain in the Atlas Range, a dwarf city had appeared and been overrun. Grindelwald's early response team discovered the horror. Hordes of goblins, orcs, and trolls had slaughtered nearly 10,000 dwarves, leaving bones gnawed clean. The attackers alone wouldn't have fazed a wizard of Grindelwald's stature, but when the team pushed deeper, they hit a violent, massive magical reaction, and realized a far stronger, tyrannical force lay beneath the mountain. Grindelwald sealed the range with considerable resources. He didn't intend to fight the beast outright. He preferred planning and, if necessary, calling Ted for help. With Dumbledore gone, Ted was the senior wizard he could still rely on. As Voldemort moved toward Africa, both Ted and Grindelwald tracked his approach. Wizards travel quickly. Apparition, the Flu Network, portkeys, enchanted broomsticks. An adversary of Voldemort's caliber can go anywhere he wants, almost without constraint. By the time Ted and Grindelwald received confirmation, Voldemort was already in the region. Above the Suez, Voldemort manifested as a swirl of black smoke, hovering while a band of 20 or 30 Death Eaters flew in his wake, levitated by enchanted items. Their faces were hard, sinister, ruthless, or numbly vacant. Among them were 7 or 8 once-dead wizards, resurrected back into service. Voldemort had mastered too many forbidden techniques along his new magical path. Ted, thinking over what he'd heard previously, realized the resurrection method resembled a hideous ritual. A living sacrifice, combined with specific body tissues used to revive the dead. If Ted's suspicions were right, this so-called resurrection was disturbingly similar to the impure world reincarnation he'd encountered in otherworld records. As the black cloud drifted over the sea, Ted's mind raced. Wherever otherworld knowledge appeared in this world, it spread and mutated in ways no one could predict. The resurrection magic Voldemort had cobbled together, was it merely inspired by ancient legends, or was it an echo of those impure reincarnation rites? Either way, the consequences were terrifying. Lord Voldemort and Gellert Grindelwald stood with the wind ripping at their robes. The air between them was taut. From a distance, Ted watched the scene on the other side of the Mediterranean through a magic satellite. This was Grindelwald's territory. He had built it over years, and the Suez Canal was being run like a fortress. Behind Grindelwald, 50 or 60 saints waited, a mix of young powerhouses and old veterans, each radiating an extraordinary aura. Voldemort's Death Eaters were a step below. There simply weren't as many of them, and most had been rescued from Azkaban. They'd survived Dementor influence by clandestine arts, but many were semi-mad. The few living dead wizards still among them were hardly inspiring, numb, hollow faces that gave off little presence. Still, some Death Eaters carried special tools. Unleashing 40 or 50 Dementors at the right moment was no problem. If the fight turned desperate, that could swing things. But the real focus was on the 2 Dark Lords. Voldemort felt unsettled. He had assumed that after Dumbledore's death, he would be unrivaled, only to discover that the first-generation Dark Lord had apparently reached the same realm. Grindelwald's power suggested he had ascended to a legendary level too. What made it worse was that the wand in Grindelwald's hand was not the Elder Wand. If Grindelwald had lost to Dumbledore 40 years ago, and the Elder Wand had been taken from him, then the wand had perished with Dumbledore, or worse, been lost. Yet Grindelwald was still formidable. Voldemort hated the idea of sharing glory, especially with a rival like Grindelwald. Pride would not allow him to back away. He lowered his voice until it hissed. First-generation Dark Lord Gellert Grindelwald, I have long wished to meet you. The sound of Voldemort's voice, strange and sibilant from its slit-like nose, made younger saints flinch. It carried in itself a kind of innate menace that few could hear without feeling cold. Grindelwald, however, did not blanch. "Humph, to be called a Dark Lord alongside you is laughable," Grindelwald said, calm and flat, his gaze drifting past Voldemort as if he were looking at something beyond him. Voldemort bristled. No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. He raised his hand. Avada Kedavra. A blinding green bolt shot forward, the killing curse as thick and fast as a human head, but in midair it split into more than a dozen thinner shafts, whirling in unpredictable paths. 3 of them darted toward Grindelwald from tricky angles. The rest were aimed straight at the saints behind him. The saints reacted instantly. Protego and other defensive charms flashed up, and Grindelwald was the quickest. A wave of power from his white bone-like wand pooled and solidified into a single elliptical shield that swallowed the dozen green lights. Ripples ran along the azure barrier as those killing curses struck. With a flick, Grindelwald sent 2 invisible spells hurtling toward Voldemort and then launched himself skyward. Voldemort's defense reacted in kind. A silvery, mercury-like shield formed before him, shifting to intercept the strikes. He turned into a column of black smoke and shot upwards, pursuing Grindelwald. Both men knew they would be hard-pressed to kill the other. Instead, they tried to inflict maximum pain on the other's forces. As the two rose, the battle on the water erupted. A Death Eater opened a square black leather bag at his waist and released it. 40 to 50 Dementors poured out like black smoke. Voldemort had already conscripted nearly all the Dementors during his raids on Azkaban. These creatures were cruel and devastating when unleashed. The temperature dropped. A choking gloom swept over the deck. But the Saints were an old, seasoned organization. Many of them were octogenarians or centenarians, and many knew the Patronus charm. Silvery Patronuses flew from their wands, weaving a ring that kept the Dementors at bay. The rest of the Saints' wands spun, and a barrage of spells, explosions, ice, flames, wind rained down. They even performed coordinated, multi-wizard castings that produced massive, synchronized effects. The Death Eaters, already outmatched and uneven in skill, were overwhelmed. In minutes, coordinated strikes shredded their formations. One Death Eater took 3 spells in succession and was blasted into bloody foam that fell into the sea. The Saints showed no mercy. Part of why the Saints were so coordinated traced back to Grindelwald's strategy. In the original timeline, Grindelwald had given up and become a feeble old man who offered little resistance when killed by Voldemort. In this altered world, however, things had changed. Strange new herbs, magical creatures, and even entire races had appeared after a celestial convergence. Elves, dwarves, and gnomes arrived and shook the magical world. Grindelwald, a seer, had clung to a sliver of hope. He waited nearly a decade, watched the world shift, then emerged from Nurmengard when the timing felt right. He became a professor at Hogwarts for a time, admired Ted's magic net utopia, but ultimately chose another path. He came to Africa. Over a year of careful work turned into near-complete control. He ruled almost 100,000 wizards there, and an organization known as the Saints secretly influenced many Muggle governments across the continent, small steps toward Grindelwald's vision of a remade magical world. His most loyal followers, 10,000 or so, had passed rigorous trials and rituals, walking through a blue flame wall and swearing contracts bound by Fidelius-like magics. Their enchantments made their magic interchangeable. What one saint cast could be augmented or joined by another with fluid, almost machine-like coordination. The scale of that network and the nominal support of nearly 100,000 wizards let Grindelwald borrow tiny amounts of power from many sources to produce vast effects. His power grew with territory and numbers. Back over the sea, the duel intensified. A dragon of blue flame unfurled behind Grindelwald and beat its wings, sending out searing blasts of heat. Voldemort answered with a tide of pale, wailing souls, the dead he had harvested and shackled, rushing forward like a screaming suicide squad. He reached into the life of the sea itself. Green motes rose from the water and rejoined him, renewing his vigor while killing all marine life within a 20-kilometer radius. Ted watched, fascinated and appalled. The two Dark Lords traded increasingly exotic dark arts for nearly 20 minutes. Grindelwald's spectacular mythic displays met Voldemort's soul-extracting, undead-commanding techniques. Ted knew only a fraction of the spells by sight, the rest he recorded to study later, and selfishly, to adapt to his game. Then an urgent message came to Voldemort from his lines. "Dark Lord, our people can't hold. It's not that we're weak, the other side is cheating." Bella, the disfigured Death Eater with a silver hand, had been shouting for a single decisive duel between the Dark Lords and forbidding interference. But the rank-and-file Death Eaters could not endure the slaughter. Of the 30-odd living wizards fighting, many were already dead or dying. Within 20 minutes, 7 of 8 living dead wizards were gone, and nearly 10 more Death Eaters had fallen. If the battle continued, the rest would be wiped out in minutes. Voldemort was furious, but he understood the calculus. A 3 to 5 hour duel might change nothing, and he would lose his core followers. Reluctantly, he ordered a retreat after leaving a chilling warning and withdrew with his remaining people. In the end, 12 Death Eaters had died in the engagement, not counting the living dead victims. Many of those lost were his oldest, most trusted followers who had fled Britain and followed him. Disposable cannon fodder could be replaced 1,000-fold. Voldemort had access to alien races he'd enslaved during his campaigns, but trusted lieutenants were harder to come by. He departed displeased, but not defeated. He had other ways to terrorize the magical world. In Eastern Europe, he had already been rounding up alien creatures and races, enslaving them, branding many with the black magic mark to ensure obedience, a tactic he'd refined during the Goblin rebellions. When the time was right, he could muster tens of thousands of expendable fighters. More than a week after the Suez Canal clash, movements began in Eastern Europe. Magical races and monstrous creatures gathered and migrated. Muggles were disturbed by the disorderly hordes. Ministries of magic across Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere went on high alert. Had the Dark Lord returned? Had Voldemort's shadow fallen on Europe again? Thanks to the reader with the last four digits 6311 for the 100 points reward. Thank you. 465. Pigeon. I lost track of time reading a novel, so I'm taking the day off. It's called The Era of Great Chinese Entertainment Directors. It didn't seem impressive at first, but the pacing was excellent. I couldn't put it down. The weather this year was abnormal in extremes. Cold enough to make you wish to freeze, hot enough to feel as if you were being boiled. Muggle scientists worried about the disruption of ocean currents and monsoons. For most of the people in power, however, that was a secondary concern. Ocean currents? Monsoons? Right now, gargantuan monsters were surfacing from the seas, some over 100 meters long. Sea transport had been crippled. Remote towns and villages were being harassed by strange phenomena. Unaccountable presences had arisen in ancient mountains and forests. Monsters rushed into towns, only to be cut down by people wielding heavy ordnance. To fight back against the onslaught of dinosaurs and other beasts, countries were churning out heavy weapons and bigger munitions as if afraid of not having enough firepower. If conventional arms only worked at 1/3 effectiveness on these creatures, they increased the power threefold. If that wasn't enough, fivefold. For now, that was the only feasible strategy. As for extreme weather, let nature take its course. September slipped in amid the hustle of repairs and mobilizations. Seventh year began. Ding. Talent, Otherworld Knowledge, Gold, triggered. Found Medivh's book, Orange. Medivh's book, Orange. Egwene, Medivh's mother, had been the guardian of Tyrusfall, a unique office forged by Azeroth's human spellcasters that pooled the power of many archmagi to protect humanity. For reasons of her own, she chose to channel that power into her son, even arranging for a 3-system archmage to father him. Medivh became an outstanding human caster, but after Egwene defeated the fallen titan Sargeras, whose influence had been buried in her, a fragment of Sargeras' immortal will awoke in Medivh. While possessed, Medivh wrote a grimoire of forbidden lore and opened the dark portal to the dying world of Draenor. This book was the personal grimoire of Sargeras himself. Kel'Thuzad later used it to summon Archimonde to Azeroth and razed the floating city of Dalaran in a single strike. Demons, spatial rights, pacts, power, and the endless astral plane. Requires 10,000 experience to exchange. Ted scratched his head. This was a tough choice. 10,000 experience for an orange-quality tome like Medivh's book was tempting. Terribly tempting. It was a book written by the Lord of the Burning Legion. The spells written in it likely concerned summoning the Legion and tearing portals between worlds. Medivh and Gul'dan had used such portals to connect two worlds and bring the orcs to Azeroth. Kel'Thuzad had used the grimoire to pull Archimonde straight through. The power inside was world-shaking. But the risks were real. What if Ted tried to use it against Lord Voldemort and ended up guiding the Burning Legion to Earth instead? That said, the knowledge wasn't the kind that drove you mad simply by existing. And in the condition the world was in, such forbidden techniques could be useful, maybe not a cure-all, but possibly a way to contain some of the breaches. He hesitated, weighing merit against peril. Meanwhile, Lord Voldemort had just taken a hit at Suez, mostly the loss of some useful subordinates. He cared little for them personally, but someone had to administer his growing realm. The Death Eaters had seized control of sizable swathes of the magical world in several Eastern European countries. Statutes of secrecy? Not for him. He used Imperio on Muggle leaders to seize both the magic world and the Muggle world. He had collected over 1,000 wizards into his coalition, some by persuasion, many by coercion, and now needed competent management. The undead wizards he raised were reliable in loyalty, but dull, and many longed instead to die in battle rather than be enslaved. His British-born lieutenants were dwindling in each engagement. After regrouping from Suez, the Death Eaters expanded rapidly. Wizards who could flee had already gone. Sweden and Norway fell easily enough after the Death Eaters brought monsters in force and targeted local magical authorities. Small nations often lacked a proper ministry of magic. One morning they executed over a dozen wizards. The rest surrendered, handing over wands and signing oaths. Registration, tribute, and binding magic contracts followed. Life that had been free for centuries was shoved back into feudal, even slave-like structures. It helped that Ted had already dismantled the Goblin Magic Factory system. Otherwise, Voldemort might have been forcing wizards into 24-hour factory shifts, tightening bolts in enchanted assembly lines. The Death Eaters were thorough. They forced other magical races into submission, goblins, murlocs, centaurs, with offers of allegiance or extinction. Smaller goblin communities fled into uninhabited mountains when they could. Murlocs, stubborn and proud, resisted until slaughter broke them. A centaur tribe was wiped out entirely. The Death Eaters rounded up hobgoblins, hill giants, kobolds, capturing or coercing craftsmen to produce tools, weapons, and magical devices. Some giant tribes joined for food. Many displaced demi-humans, dwarves, and gnomes fled west. But the Death Eaters tried to capture these artisans because their skills were too valuable to leave in the field. They pushed south through Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Croatia, and Hungary, all the way to Greece and Italy before pausing. Those two countries still contained traditional centers of wizarding strength, around 20,000 wizards each, so the Death Eaters were cautious. Still, the momentum was alarming. Eastern Europe was effectively under Voldemort's shadow. Many local wizards escaped, at least 60% in some areas, seeking refuge abroad or even in America. Germany became the new front line. Death Eaters probed and harassed constantly. In the streets of some Muggle cities, robed wizards fell from the air and died. The Death Eaters' monstrous cannon fodder, ground-bound giants, undead, caused collateral damage among Muggles. Once, a giant in a tantrum smashed cars and stores until a Barrett round took his head off. The Death Eaters retaliated by bombing a police station with exploding charms and escaping openly through the smoke. The German ministry is requesting more support, a secretary told Minister Amelia Bones at the British Ministry of Magic. Bones glanced at the letter, set it down, and rubbed her temples. They had already dispatched 2 batches of aurors and hit wizards to Germany. If Germany fell completely, Voldemort could return to Britain. Bones understood the stakes. In a magical war, the attacker held the initiative. Wizards could fly. Apparat used portkeys. Concentrating forces on the front risked leaving home bases exposed to betrayal. "Any movement from Hogwarts?" she asked. The secretary replied, "They've been contacting many people, accelerating the magic net laydown, and they've neutralized some otherworld monsters." Accelerating the magic net? At a time like this? Even in crisis, nations still had to stabilize their territories and eliminate immediate threats. Ted, for one, was out in Spain at that moment, sealing a node in a growing magical network. El Escorial, outside Madrid, had reported strong ley line fluctuations, A-class on the detection scale, suggesting a likely otherworld terrain infiltration. The local wizards had been monitoring it and found no terrain breach, but they did find something else, a giant knight-like monster. It wore a crown-shaped golden helmet and sat astride a warhorse the size of a small elephant. Both rider and mount were plated in intricate, dark gold armor. The knight carried an enormous axe spear that hummed with subtle magic and a golden shield larger than a round table. It patrolled a broad area and attacked anything within reach. Spanish wizards sent an elite team and were routed. The knight's magic resistance was enormous. Its attacks were devastating. One swing made the ground quake. One charge from the warhorse was unstoppable. Ted happened to be in Spain building underground magic net facilities at a nearby node and was called in. He dealt with the big tree knight in 3 minutes, exchanged pleasantries with highly impressed Spanish wizards, and left. That node completed the final magic net coverage point in the area. The network was nearly complete. Nearly there, Ted felt the experience bar that had been empty begin to stir. He had chosen the path of a magical marvel, an integrated magical world network, to envelop the globe and set its operational rules. Full global coverage wasn't necessary. Covering 2 continents and large swathes of the world was already enough. If Dumbledore was still alive, he might succeed in other plans. Every day that passed made that less likely. If Dumbledore fell, Ted knew he might have to face Voldemort himself, along with Grindelwald and Snape. 3 against 1, Ted smiled to himself. Huh? Magic World. Updated. Starla, across the ocean in America, cried out. Nancy, Ted's wife, handed him a cup of coffee. Last time it was simple sequence potions. What did they add now? The game's been patching a lot lately. Let's see. Dream Experience Qualification? A closed beta? Ted scanned the notes. Players around the world were reporting that some well-known users had received a Dream Experience Qualification, allowing them to test the next version of the game in advance. Some wizards were cautious. Most players took the chance and logged in that very night. It's a dream mode? Play the game inside a dream? It's so lifelike. Forums erupted. Debate raged over whether entering and controlling dreams violated a person's last privacy. For nearly 100,000 Muggle players, though, the argument fell flat. Reality was terrifying enough. Soaring prices, crumbling public order, sudden monsters, and criminals with strange powers left ordinary people desperate for any reprieve. If a dream could grant even a few moments of peace, or better yet, a way to gain a usable advantage, players would take it. 1 week into the closed tests, a player discovered the game could actually grant small real effects. The system noted that actions in the dream had been recognized and rewarded. That player woke with a weak healing ability. Minor wounds closed faster. Word spread like wildfire. Play it. Night after night, more than 20,000 players queued to enter dreams and chase power. Ted had to be careful. He had to limit what abilities the dream mode could bestow so that rewards stayed balanced. Still, he felt that a door had opened. Possibilities thrummed just beyond reach. Thanks to reader Xiaoyao Daluo Xianren Chu Richin for the 500-point reward. Thank you. 467. Voldemort eats turtle for the second time. Chapter 444. Lord Voldemort's second setback. Information in the British magical world leaked like water through a sieve. To keep a secret, only a handful of people could know. Otherwise, the Death Eaters would hear about a ministry meeting before supper was finished. Still, many of Voldemort's closest Death Eaters had been killed or incapacitated. Fewer than 30 now remained, and most of them had crawled out of Azkaban, hardened by Dementors, half-mad, scarcely able to control their emotions, let alone think clearly. There were almost no Barty-like strategists or old Malfoys left who could hold an operation together. They could gather intelligence, but understanding and acting on it was another matter entirely. Bella couldn't analyze complex reports, integrate information, and launch a campaign into the German magical world. She simply didn't have that capacity. So although the Death Eaters knew that many people from Hogwarts and the Order of the Phoenix were busily building the magic net, they didn't take it seriously. Let them build it, they thought. When it's finished, it'll be ours. In truth, the Death Eaters couldn't afford to ignore the magic net. Ted had just opened permissions. Before, the magic net had only run the Ideal Land platform, games, forums, and so on. The net was the tool, and Ideal Land the main body. Now Ted allowed others to build their own platforms on top of the magic net. He even started introductory magic rune programming self-study courses, teaching people how to write magic software using runes. The goblins of Britain felt betrayed by history. They'd fought for their own online presence and nearly gone extinct. Ted handed them access and taught them by the hand. He unlocked the net because the basic structure was finished. A comprehensive, three-dimensional magic net now began to blanket Europe and Africa. You could build private platforms, secret networks, but nothing on that net escaped Ted's view. He could shut any channel down at will. He had given up the monopoly on the surface, while binding the net into the leyline network and taking control at the roots of magic itself. Once that connection took hold, the net would be impossible to eradicate. Ted had pried open a legendary door and through that sliver, seen another world. Voldemort himself was brilliant at magic and manipulating hearts, but his vision did not extend to large-scale coordination. He wanted power, and he believed power would solve everything, be strong, and nothing could stop you. His subordinates were people to be ordered, perhaps punished, but never expected to shine. When the German ministry resisted, he merely smiled. If he personally acted, he could crush the entire German magical world in hours. The British ministry, however, his homeland, was different. 50 or 60 years of rise and fall were carved into him. He was the Dark Lord who had torn his soul into pieces and survived the unthinkable. That remnant soul, and later the magic knowledge he had gleaned from another world, had reshaped him. He chased anything that hinted of otherworldly magic. Strange beings and foreign techniques were brought to him. Powerful otherworlders he would seek out personally. Recently, he had found one he liked, an apparent otherworld necromancer. Pale, shrunken skin clinging to bone, a tattered black robe, a yellow ribbon awkwardly floating as if defying gravity. Half his skull had been flattened, and one eye was a black socket. The other glowed blood red. He had appeared 2.5 days earlier in an abandoned cemetery, where he quickly raised the buried dry bones and conjured an entire necromantic structure, a great cemetery with its own magical circulation. Skeleton warriors, mounted skeletons, zombies, and elite zombies appeared periodically. In only 2 days, it had amassed dozens, then hundreds of undead. The magical world under Death Eater rule was already chaotic. By the time the Death Eaters reacted and decided to send troops, the Necromancer's forces had grown large and resilient. The first wave, disposable cannon fodder and a handful of wizards, was almost entirely annihilated. A few fast goblins fled and never returned. 1 of 6 dispatched wizards had been killed. The Necromancer reanimated that corpse into his own ranks. Alarm finally spread through the Death Eaters. A second wave, stronger, managed only to gain ground but could not penetrate the great cemetery. The undead regenerated limbs through death magic and recovered quickly. Bella, commanding the front, grew furious when reinforcements stalled and learned the enemy practiced necromancy. She was ecstatic because her master loved such otherworldly practitioners. Voldemort came in person. He interviewed the necromancer with a curiosity that barely hid his hunger, the smile threatening to split his face. The necromancer refused to be interrogated. Instead, he ranted about having failed to fulfill orders from Lord Ains and being unable to complete his mission. That insolence provoked the Dark Lord. They fought on the spot. Voldemort held back at first, wanting to study his foe rather than strike with a killing curse immediately. The necromancer, however, was no pushover. A level 16 elite summoner with no incantation instant casting and a fearsome spell, Scorched Corpse Fire, that burned life itself into desiccated husks, ideal for his ranks. But Voldemort was on another plane. He waved his snake staff, and a flood of magic, like a spiritual serpent, deflected the corpse fireballs. When the fireballs detonated in front of him, a barrier of black smoke swallowed their effect. Skeletons and zombies that rushed him were met with a conjured basilisk of green magic fire. It devoured 30 to 50 undead in an instant, reducing them to ash and draining their death energy into itself. The necromancer tried switching to death-infused ice, but it, too, failed. He kept summoning to stall, but Voldemort shattered his defenses with 3 casual spells and had him on the back foot. When Voldemort killed the necromancer and attempted to extract his soul to read his memories, something unexpected happened. The necromancer's soul registered a magical fluctuation and vanished. Someone had unsummoned it. Some pre-placed teleportation in the soul itself had triggered. Voldemort had been careless. The prize he thought he had snatched slipped away. Furious, he erupted, blasting the area to rubble. "Who dares toy with the Dark Lord?" he thundered. While Voldemort mulled over the lost opportunity, Ted Epiphany was dealing with a different otherworld problem in Merseyside. A strange magic signature had signaled the arrival of a band of lizardmen, an unfamiliar, battle-ready group that clashed with investigating wizards. 3 initial investigators suffered badly, one with a broken arm, another nearly killed by a short, oddly shaped blade. An Auror team sent after them fared worse. The lizardmen were shockingly tough in melee and bore innate magic resistance and odd abilities. One resisted a thunderous blast and merely smoked. Another wielded an ice crystal short knife that released freezing currents. The Aurors nearly froze themselves and were forced to retreat. Reinforcements arrived with artifacts and enchanted gear, and the tide turned. Yet the dozen or so lizardmen fought a disciplined, resilient withdrawal. Ted came upon the scene just as the lizardmen found themselves surrounded. One short-knife lizardman made a desperate move. The ice crystal blade flashed, and an enormous vortex of cold erupted, casting a blizzard and plunging the area into sub-zero temperatures for 100 meters. 3 surrounding wizards froze solid, frost scabbing their faces. The short-knife lizardman leapt to finish them, but when his blade struck, it hit nothing. The 3 wizards, frozen one moment, were standing before Ted the next. Ted reached out, and a pale white radiance flowed over them, warming and healing frostbite. The short-knife lizardman paused. "There's a master?" he thought. Another lizardman, larger and more terrifying, more alligator than lizard, could no longer contain himself. Covered in black, gleaming scales and the size of an overlarge man, he was muscle under armor. 3 magic sigils flickered across him, and his fist swelled with power. He launched a flying pounce aimed at Ted and the 3 healed wizards. Ted didn't move. Then, without warning, he and the 3 wizards vanished from their spots. The alligator man smashed down where they had been, the impact sounding like a small car colliding with the earth. The ground caved in, stones scattering in all directions. Surrounding wizards gaped. Wandless and silent apparition? 3 people? How did he do that? "He's Ted Epiphany," someone breathed. Ted handed the 3 injured to nearby healers. "Stay back. I'll handle this," he said. The large lizardman was a level 16 elite with innate level 3 magic resistance. His indestructible defense boosted him to level 6 magic resistance, with 18 strength and 20 constitution. No wonder ordinary spells barely fazed him. The short-knife lizardman was a level 18 elite, the ice crystal blade clearly a red-quality magical weapon. As Ted assessed their levels, the big lizardman charged again, roaring, "Don't run! I'll smash you flat with one punch." Ted raised a finger. Suddenly, the ground beneath the big lizardman turned to a trap of viscous mud. He slipped, flailed, and sank deeper the more he struggled, his limbs coated in sticky muck until he resembled a battered drumstick wrapped in batter. Other lizardmen reacted. Archers loosed arrows, but the projectiles vanished mid-flight. The short-knife lizardman launched a silent pounce for Ted's eyes, but 2 meters out he froze in midair, suspended by Ted's manipulation of gravity. He tried to swing his blade. A pale current of cold raced at Ted, splitting into 2 streams and passing harmlessly by his sides. The ground under Ted stayed unharmed, while the earth on both sides solidified into ice. Ted smiled. "Don't make trouble. Tell me who you are and where you come from." The short-knife lizardman's eyes unfocused, his body sagged, and he murmured, "My name is Zarius Shasha. I am a lizardman of the Greenclaw tribe." 468. Legend. Legend. Ding. Talent. Otherworld knowledge. Gold. Triggered. Discovered. Arlia text. Purple. The Arlia text, purple, authored by an unknown hand around 3000 BC, was said to have been written on clay tablets. Rumors abounded about whether the originals still survived or had long since been destroyed. Different versions had once circulated as far away as the Yellow River Basin in the Far East. The book recorded matters concerning the Deep Ones, Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, Cthulhu's star spawn, the Cthulhu's sons Zoth-Omog and Ghadanathoa, and the great Cthulhu himself. It described the sinking of Mu and Arlia and hinted that Arlia might one day rise from the sea again. It even mentioned Sathogua, the one who waits in the dark. Reading it granted terrifying otherworld knowledge, how to enslave Deep Ones, summon Dagon, even evocate the sleeping Cthulhu, and insights into interstellar matters. But the book exacted a price. It inflicted a powerful spirit shock on readers. Those with fewer than 20 spirit points would be driven insane beyond recovery. Even those with more than 20 would hear persistent, troubling whispers. In the name of the land of Yhanthle, beneath the sea and its inhabitants, praise the ruler of all. Requires 10 experience points to redeem. 10 experience points? Ted burst out laughing in exasperation. Damn it, you're not even trying to hide it anymore. By the usual logic, if something is more troublesome, it should cost less. This thing was a bottomless well of trouble. If this world had no Cthulhu before, and he redeemed this knowledge and as a result put a Cthulhu to sleep in the ocean, where would he get after-sales service? Sail a ship out to knock Cthulhu unconscious so he could keep sleeping? No way. Ted absolutely would not redeem that. One must understand, Cthulhu loved to give candy, often whispering, "I await your dream." Dreams were Ted's prime domain. The descent of his mirror world, including the magic world, had developed on the basis of dreams. Dreams were the best avenue for spirit power to manifest. If he unleashed some sort of dream virus, he would be the one truly harmed. No, keep it away. It was October 1997. Hogwarts had been open for a month. Because of the extraordinary circumstances that year, everything was tense. Many older students could not return for their 7th year. Some families feared for their children's safety and refused to send them. Hogwarts was becoming Great Britain's main base of resistance against the Death Eaters. While no one wanted to live under the Death Eaters, not everyone wanted to fight either. Many preferred resignation, waiting, and watching. That was understandable, and, in fact, the majority. Some people chose to relocate amid the turmoil in Europe. Australia had become a popular choice. Though its population of magical creatures had exploded, leading to more beasts than humans, many wizards still judged it tolerable and emigrated en masse. 2 days earlier, a huge thing had emerged from the sea there. It had devoured a cruise ship with hundreds aboard, split the vessel in two, sunk 2 warships sent to help, and finally been destroyed with an ultra-large yield depth charge. Witnesses reported a mushroom cloud and said the monster's corpse stained several kilometers of sea red. It took 7 or 8 ships to haul the carcass ashore, and nobody knew what to do with it. In those days, nobody dared go into the water. Many newly arrived wizards fled back in panic. When a nest is overturned, no egg is left intact. There is no truly safe place in this world. Safety was forged by guns and wands in your hands. At Hogwarts, 6th and 7th year students were already undergoing military-style training and organizing into independent formations. Ted's earlier work laying a comprehensive magic net across Europe and Africa had been possible only with the help of classmates, friends who had worked with him on net programming, who helped build signal towers and satellites, who were writing the code and physically raising the infrastructure that would become the magic net utopia. It was thanks to them that his path of wonders could proceed. Now only the final step remained. He was waiting for a crucial moment. He had learned a great deal from Snape and Grindelwald. Such lessons needed time to ripen. When the right moment came, they would bear fruit. In the past month, Germany finally couldn't hold. The Death Eaters had no bottom line. In war, the side with none held the advantage. They drove captured cannon fodder troops across Germany's borders, indifferent to Muggle casualties or to exposing the magical world. Death Eaters rode on broomsticks, directing monsters, goblins, hill giants, orcs, into Muggle cities. Which of those creatures wasn't dangerous? If German wizards simply stood aside, Muggle casualties would climb. Death Eaters deliberately used large-scale spells, targeting Muggle buildings and streets. German wizards had to intervene to stop the mass slaughter. With each engagement, the balance tilted against them. Lord Voldemort's forces had the additional advantage of necromancy. They revived fallen wizards as undead, raised skeletons from graveyards, and multiplied their ranks with every battle. Even dead German wizards might be resurrected and controlled. Frontline wizards began carrying a grim magical device. If they died, an unquenchable flame would cremate them to prevent their bodies from being used by the enemy. Over 200 wizards had died in the past month, an avalanche compared to previous years. 2 days earlier, the German Ministry of Magic had issued an emergency message to neighboring countries. The war situation was dire. The ministry declared itself in exile, resorting to guerrilla warfare inside Germany. Its headquarters had fallen. Bella had led over 300 wizards and 1,000 cannon fodder troops in a 3-day battle. More than half the cannon fodder had been killed. The German wizards were exhausted. Had they not planned a retreat, they would have been annihilated. Most personnel escaped, but the occupation of the ministry marked the fall of the German magical world. Routes out of the country were sealed by Death Eaters. Those caught fleeing faced severe punishment. Many could only wait in terror for the Dark Lord's judgment. When news of the German ministry's exile spread, surrounding countries panicked. Britain was especially alarmed. Their history with Voldemort made them a likely target. With Germany fallen, Death Eaters could fly straight across the Channel and strike Britain. At last, some parents stopped burying their heads in the sand and actually sent their children to school. They could no longer pretend safety remained an option. At this point, you could not act on impulse. You had to unite what you could. Make as many friends as possible. Life at Hogwarts became saturated with purpose. Outside regular classes, daily life was semi-militarized. After lessons, students worked on magical defenses, helped professors erect protective wards, repaired enchanted devices, grew medicinal herbs in greenhouses, assisted at the magical golem production site. Poor first years, just entering the wizarding world, found all of this overwhelming. The incoming class was enormous, 189 new students, with 98 from Muggle families and about 50 from other races. It was ironic. At such a critical juncture, the magical population seemed to be flourishing. The population crisis that had plagued the magical world for decades showed signs of easing. Then Voldemort returned. On a quiet street in Munich, a middle-aged man stepped out of a shop carrying paper bags as if he'd been shopping. He looked every bit the meticulous German, precise, methodical, and ordinary. But a team of Death Eaters had already been tailing him. The man was Mr. Hanks, a Muggle-born member of the German Ministry of Magic. After the ministry went underground, supplies, herbs, potion ingredients, alchemical materials were scarce. To sustain the underground resistance, operatives risked the black market. The Death Eaters had learned from experience how to deal with guerrilla wizards, cut off their supplies, set traps, and catch them. Hanks was no amateur. He had been involved in many operations to apprehend dark wizards. After circling twice, he realized he was being followed. To avoid compromising colleagues, he suddenly broke into a run in a different direction. Magic erupted on the street, colored spells and explosions, ordinary people screaming and ducking into shops. These scenes had become common, and the authorities offered no explanations. Though Hanks apparated to another street, 5 minutes later, the Death Eaters caught up. He was wounded in the thigh. His wand was ripped from his hand, and he was taken. The team hauled him to a temporary outpost to interrogate him. "Speak. Germany belongs to the Dark Lord. Don't be ungrateful," one Death Eater sneered, rifling through Hank's bag for Veritasirum as a way to force his surrender. He took particular pleasure in making upright wizards into traitors, psychological satisfaction that lasted them a month. Hanks, bleeding and in pain, laughed sadly. "I thought about this day. I know everything. Save your Veritasirum. You'll only get ashes." He smiled, and the interrogator's grin faltered. "Quick, control him," someone shouted. They had taken his wand and searched him thoroughly, so the smile chilled them. Then, to their horror, sticky orange-red flames from Hank's mouth and nostrils, igniting into a blazing torch. The blast shoved Death Eaters backward. Robes caught fire. Beards and hair were singed. In the midst of the inferno, Hanks vanished. His last conscious thought before everything dissolved into smoke was strangely calm. It didn't hurt. His colleague had told him it was a special potion sent from Britain. After drinking it, you could channel magic without wand or gesture, just thought, and you would gloriously turn to ash. His colleague had been right. It truly did not hurt. He rose like smoke and faded from that eerie interrogation room. After an uncertain interval, Hank's consciousness reawakened. He opened his eyes and looked around in blank confusion. Where am I? Am I dead? The place felt oddly familiar. Wait, this was his home in the magic world. He'd spent more than a week doing quests to buy that South American-style magical sculpture, had tracked a rare elite across the map and slain it for that system reward, the first kill of that elite. I'm in the game? I died? Hanks fumbled at himself, astonished at how real his body felt. Ted, to prevent confusion between reality and the game, had limited the game's realism to 80%, but now the sensation was indistinguishable from waking life. He tried to summon the interface. System, character panel. The panel flickered into existence before him. He was alive in the game. A system message, Parker, explained everything. Rebirth inside the game after death was not unprecedented. When Ted had dealt with the Elder Beholder, many ordinary people had claimed a kind of eternal life in a heaven after death. Ted had already developed a deeper grasp of souls, how to prevent them from being lost to limbo, and, with human alchemy, even how to restore them. Barty had been the first test subject. An operative who had been thrown into the game and served as an NPC for over a year was another of Ted's trials. The so-called glorious potion sent from Britain had been concocted by Ted and Snape. Those who died after taking it had their souls collected by the magic net and transported into the game. Hanks had a game character. He had been reborn. Hanks read Parker's explanation and was stunned. He didn't grasp the principles, but the implication was straightforward. The magic net could grant a form of immortality. That was enough. It had been Ted's design to encourage wizards to fight bravely, but he had not expected this mechanism to become the final piece of his legendary plan. When Hanks revived in-game, the real-world Ted felt a surge of spirit power. He sat up, eyes wide. "It's here." "What's here?" Hermione asked. "The opportunity is here," Ted replied. The final link of the world wonder, the weaving of the magic net, was people. Ted had covered sky and earth, hardware and code, but he had lacked human hearts. He had lacked human participation. Now human hearts had arrived. The sudden influx of spirit energy even disrupted Hogwarts' magical systems for an instant before settling. It felt like an illusion, yet it wasn't. The world had not yet visibly changed, but Ted knew the change was already within his grasp. True legend Ted, the turning of this world was now beginning. 4469, the Weaver of the Magic Web. Ted Epiphany had entered the legendary realm, and only Hermione knew. He planned to act as usual, waiting to spring a big surprise on Lord Voldemort. How he got in still puzzled him. It had felt like all the necessary conditions suddenly aligned, and then it just happened. Before, even if you knew what to do, you still needed the right moment, an opportunity that only revealed itself when it wanted to. That was why Grindelwald and Snape had been so vague. Like Snape, Ted had watched his own ascension happen firsthand. It had been over half a year since he brewed and drank the ultimate potion. For months he'd behaved normally, guarding and learning, and then one day, like a metabolic shift, the change came and completed itself. It was the same for him. The magic web already touched 2 continents, his abilities met the requirements, but something tiny had been missing. That last piece, a utility developed to help sacrificed warriors, finally activated after Hanks was the first to reincarnate into the magical virtual mind world, the game world being one facet of it. System message flashed through his mind, his new stats and titles. Current levels and professions: level 20 wizard, level 12 mind mage, level 1 magic web weaver. Talent gained: magic web weaver gold. All attributes: strength, constitution, agility, intelligence, perception, spirit, charisma, luck had increased by +2. Intelligence, perception, and spirit gained an extra +3 each, 25 attribute points at once. Knowledge skills: transfiguration, potions, prophecy, herbology, dark arts, magical creatures, bloodline modification, runology, alchemy, artifact manufacturing, each rose by 1 level. 11 skill points in one go. No wonder Voldemort had been able to turn his fortunes around. There really were vast benefits to reaching the legendary realm. Magic Webweaver was Ted's legendary profession. Its abilities were essentially a comprehensive upgrade of every magic web-related function. After his promotion, he hadn't made any grand displays. Instead, he quietly tuned the web's architecture and domains. Even with Parker's help, a specialization focused and super-enhanced for the web, Ted had found it hard to fully master the system before. As the web grew and users multiplied, information exploded exponentially. Even an intelligence stat of 30, processing data 24 hours a day, would not necessarily be enough. The problem wasn't quantity alone, but the need for a qualitative shift. Advancing to legendary Magic Webweaver provided that qualitative change. Magic web information now flowed through Ted's mind at an incomprehensible speed and in ways he couldn't easily explain. The difference was like a conventional calculator evolving into a quantum computer. Where information had once required layer upon layer of filtering by Parker, Ted now functioned as the web's god. Everything operated inside his mind, beyond the constraints of physical speed. No detail could escape his observation. Loopholes and flaws appeared like exposed threads, and he began to repair them, to weave. Runes and sigils on the web seemed to wake at his will, arranging themselves, weaving functions into new patterns. The magic web's boundaries expanded, and it started to excavate deeper layers. In regions like Asia and America, where local infrastructure had been insufficient, the web had previously only provided basic signal coverage and needed special arrangements for the mirror world to descend. Now the web extended without local support. It probed inward, down toward the Earth's core, seeking origins, and outward, into the rudimentary network of magical satellites and the moon. Ted could feel distinctions even among those who'd reached the legendary realm, differences not of raw power, but of path and level. Some magi pursued inward paths toward self and essence, others pursued outward paths toward universal rules. Ted's path, aided by near-miraculous wonders and the mental resonance of almost 1 million web users, was among the top-tier routes. If he continued, the magic web might one day envelop the entire planet, delve into matter's essence, converse with primordial magic, and expand into near-Earth space. The web could become a planetary neural network, a magical brain, a fusion of magic and mind power, where every consciousness on the web served as a neuronal cell. That prospect made Ted consider future growth. He planned to fully upgrade his mind mage profession. Wizard had reached its peak for him. Legendary professions couldn't be upgraded through the system, but mind mage still could. If mind mage reached level 20, might he gain another legendary profession? He'd accrued 157,463 experience points over 3 months. Leveling Mind Mage from 12 to 14 required 169,000 XP, but with a 10% talent reduction, it was doable. He issued the command playfully in his head, System, upgrade Mind Mage, 2 levels up. A brief, private glee. It would likely be difficult to invent a magical marvel surpassing the magic web later. He joked inwardly about attaching planetary engines and making Earth a wandering planet, designing 2-dimensional foil weapons, building a Dyson sphere or a Halo-like space station. Meanwhile, October had been brutal for the British magical world. Students at Hogwarts discussed international affairs between lessons, and many professors began teaching practical, self-preservation magic and combat experience in class. Ted had compiled his own experiences into online courses and created training NPCs on the ideal land to help young witches and wizards practice duels. Classroom lectures taught theory, but simulated, hands-on experience instilled instinct. Professor Flitwick's students, for example, benefited from practice sessions that forced them to learn vigilance. Don't trust strangers. Don't underestimate dark wizards. Don't dismiss an enemy just because they lack a wand. The ideal land scenarios included ambushes, poisonings, and encounters with magical creatures. Most students experienced being deceived, ambushed, or even counter-killed in simulations. The intensity produced reflexive defenses. At the first syllable of certain dark arts charms, a protego would spring up. The training worked, though it weighed heavily on young shoulders. Ted set up mental counseling courses online to help them cope. At first, he tried a therapist NPC with big wavy hair to force exposure therapy. Later, he swapped it for Snape's visage and saw morale improve. The adults were hardly less tense. Minister Bones fretted over a critical lack of combat power. Intelligence now suggested Voldemort had over 200 fighters capable of matching elite aurors, thousands of ordinary wizard combatants, and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of monster troops serving as cannon fodder. Voldemort's ability to resurrect famous dead wizards and field vast numbers made his forces terrifying. Many hit wizards chose to resign rather than risk family and lives against Death Eater reprisals. Death Eaters weren't only brutal in battle, they targeted enemies' families, leaving black magic marks in the sky after massacres as a warning. That sort of terror had allowed them to flourish for nearly a decade. Official British forces were thin. Elite aurors numbered less than 50. Ordinary aurors were only a few dozen. Hit wizards exceeded 100. Other potential combatants counted for less than 100. Yet Britain's long magical tradition meant civilian groups still mattered. The Order of the Phoenix remained a core force, around 20 elite auror-level fighters, and various ancient small magical societies were quietly in contact with Ted, the de facto controller of the modern order. They remembered the chaos of Voldemort's earlier reign and didn't want to repeat it. Ted himself, though only 17, was widely considered a decisive factor in any confrontation. Few felt they could confidently defeat him single-handedly. He could take on many opponents at once. These alliances, local militias, and the Order kept Britain resilient. Border reports grew tense through October. Skirmishes and raids were frequent. Death Eater activity had spread across the strait and started operating in waters around the British Isles. Rebellions in their rear occasionally flared. The front lines writhed, but no decisive large-scale invasion had occurred by late October. The sides remained locked in attrition into November. Then a system ping, ding, talent, otherworld knowledge triggered. New discovery, anti-aging potion, APTX-4869 formula, read. Ted read the file. APTX-4869 was a mysterious drug from a foreign continuum, a development of Shiho Miyano, codenamed Sherry, known as Ihibara, who had been part of the Black Organization. Designed to reverse time, the experimental compound was highly toxic and invisibly lethal in most cases. In rare, unlucky circumstances, it caused the consumer's body to regress to childhood. The transformation brought intense heat and the sensation of bones melting. Mechanistically, it induced programmed cell death, while simultaneously upregulating telomerase, spurring cell proliferation, usually deadly, but occasionally triggering a bizarre regression where everything but the nervous system, bones, muscles, organs, hair, returned to a youthful state. Consumption was a gamble. One pill might roll back 15 years, or it might be a death sentence. Exchange cost, 2,333 experience points. Ted smirked. Useful, but only in strange circumstances. Wizards commonly lived 200 years. The Philosopher's Stone was still an option. He could always modify himself. Space Marine enhancements plus Witcher traits, not immune to aging but less susceptible. Still, true eternal youth, continuous reversal combined with longevity, was an alluring synergy. For now, he was only 17. Turning into a toddler would be awkward. He decided to buy it anyway. Why not keep an emergency anti-aging formula in storage? He closed the inventory and looked out the window. Early November had arrived with a sudden, heavy snowfall and a temperature drop of more than 10 degrees overnight. Weather extremes were getting out of hand. Ted briefly considered adjusting Europe's climate via the magic web, but any large-scale manipulation might alert Voldemort. The thought made him bristle. It was Voldemort, ultimately. His machinations had raised the world's tension. Hogwarts' atmosphere was too stressed. Students were living with constant combat readiness, and that strain wasn't healthy. Ted could have used the magic web weaver to subtly manipulate data and outcomes so that the Death Eaters lost without ever knowing why. But neutralizing Voldemort himself was the core problem. If he teamed up with Grindelwald and Snape, killing Voldemort might be feasible, but Voldemort could now resurrect, perhaps more easily than before when Horcruxes had been his anchor. Snape claimed to have a method, but unproven tricks were risky. If the plan failed once, Voldemort would never be trapped that way again. If Voldemort stirred chaos across multiple fronts, any chance to destroy him would vanish. Ted wondered whether Neville, haunted by a piece of Voldemort's soul embedded in his forehead, might be of use. The fragment could be a strange key. Before he could act on any of those ideas, an urgent message popped through the ideal land. His informant had news. The Death Eaters had launched a massive crossing of the strait and were pushing into England proper. What was meant to come had come. Chapter 447, Ministry of Magic, Offensive and Defensive Battle, 2.0. November 1st was Halloween, and true to form, it was eventful. The Death Eaters' vanguard had landed in Britain. Lord Voldemort, however, hadn't been paying much attention to the fighting. Lately, he'd been absorbed in studying the Great Cemetery, a necromantic structure another world necromancer had built using an abandoned graveyard. Nothing like it had existed in this magical world before. If one squinted, the pyramids of Egypt shared a distant resemblance, but beyond the superficial similarity, the effects were completely different. The Great Cemetery could siphon off a portion of the world's rules and continuously produce undead with only minimal magic power. Skeletons, zombies, even higher-tier undead and undead modifications. Though the necromancer's work was unfinished, the site held embryonic forms of all these possibilities. Voldemort had been poring over the thing for weeks. He'd even experimented on 7 or 8 wizards, turning them into living dead in an attempt to understand resurrection in this living dead mode. Without proper knowledge, relying on brute trial and error, he made slow progress. Life and death rules are high-level, subtle stuff. Voldemort's growing obsession with the Great Cemetery had nothing to do with nostalgia for the dead. He sought to master life and death magic so he could press onward after conquering Europe. His true target was Africa. Grindelwald had quietly built a huge empire in Black Africa and attained legendary status. That infuriated Voldemort. After Dumbledore's death, there should be only one living legend in the magical world, him. That another ancient rival persisted stung. Grindelwald had to die. If he could grasp the rules of death and resurrection, perhaps he could finally put Grindelwald down. So he tolerated the delays of his subordinates, though grudgingly. West Europe had taken 2 months to get to Britain with all the forces under his command. Voldemort considered that disgraceful. Still, now a legendary wizard, he had learned to let his direct lieutenants have face and chances to perform. Watching them seize Britain in a week would at least entertain him while he pursued grander aims. Among those lieutenants, Bella and her circle were confident. Voldemort had given them a curt mandate: take Britain in a week, break London in 3 days, and spend the remaining 4 subduing the rest of Britain and taking Ireland. None of the British Isles could be left untaken. Emboldened, they set out. They had been overly optimistic. Their miscalculation had first shown itself in Germany. Attacking a major power like Germany was different from sweeping through Eastern Europe, Canon, where each country had only a few thousand wizards and offered little resistance. Germany fielded over 20,000, many of them elite, and the Death Eaters had been badly bruised. In the initial engagements, many newly conscripted Death Eaters and living dead wizards were cut down, and the losses among monster cannon fodder were staggering. According to later Death Eater tallies, at least 6,000 monster units were lost to German wizards, giants, 2-headed ogres, and similar elites among them. 2/3 of those losses had occurred in the first 2 weeks. When the German ministry began to crumble and its forces went into exile, resistance slackened, but the damage was done. Why had Germany managed to do so well? Ted thought the answer lay partly with the changes wrought by the ideal land and the magic net. The emergence of the magic net had raised wizards' overall capability. The more organized and densely connected a wizarding community, the greater the effect. They shared knowledge, magic items, runic artifacts, potions, and techniques more rapidly. The Death Eaters were taken aback by unfamiliar magics and items. But beyond the net, Ted believed Germany failed for strategic reasons. They fought as they always had, piecemeal attrition, dozens of small squad skirmishes. That approach looked like it limited losses, but it played right into the Death Eaters' hands. Voldemort didn't fear attrition. Fallen Death Eaters were mass resurrected into living dead in the rear, and cannon fodder was replaceable. By nibbling away at the enemy bit by bit, Germany slowly exhausted itself until it could no longer stand. The British Ministry of Magic decided to learn from Germany's mistakes. With so many Death Eaters now ashore, the ministry concluded they had to strike hard before the invaders established themselves. At 4 a.m. on November 1st, Minister Bones organized 200 elite wizards and launched a pincer strike on the Death Eaters quartered near Dover. The Death Eaters were still unloading cannon fodder. A decisive blow now could blunt the invasion and destroy supplies that would otherwise wreak havoc on the Muggle population. 2 groups of roughly 100 wizards, divided into teams of 5 or 6, took to the night sky on flying broomsticks. The little coastal town the Death Eaters had taken over was mostly emptied of Muggles. The remaining villagers hid in basements and prayed. The vanguard didn't use raw destructive spells. Instead, they hurled a string of human-headed magical devices, 20 or 30 in all, that detonated in midair and emitted a wave that interfered with the flow of magic. The Death Eaters had sentries and temporary defenses, so the explosions did not physically destroy the town. A barrier held. But the blasts unbalanced the local magic. A magically sustained barrier began to flicker and twist, then popped. From the heights, the British rained down color-shifting spells. Ted helped, though not on the battlefield. He had quietly tweaked subtle rule parameters through the magic net. The magic bomb's disruptive effects were amplified, applying about a 9-3 level debuff to many common Death Eater spells. Spells the Death Eaters usually cast with ease suddenly faltered, some failing outright. At the same time, the British spells were enhanced. One wizard in the high sky tossed alchemical bombs that detonated in rapid succession, throwing several Death Eaters off balance. Without their shield charms, they might have been incinerated. Magic regeneration sped up for the attackers, and a sudden blue barrier occasionally snuffed enemy spells, as if temporary help had descended from the heavens. Taken by surprise and outmatched in the air, the Death Eaters were suppressed. The British adopted hit-and-run tactics: strike from the sky, withdraw before getting bogged down. The operation lasted only 7 or 8 minutes. Then, the wizards flew off. After they had put enough distance between themselves and the town, their magical items glowed, and they vanished. By the time the Death Eater reinforcements arrived, a few dozen of the most elite living dead, they found charred streets, smoking ruins, shredded monsters, and many of their own blown apart. Over 40 Death Eaters lay dead, nearly 100 wounded. More than 100 living dead units were destroyed. They weren't afraid of death, but they died quickly. Of the 400-plus cannon fodder troops, fewer than 100 remained. All advanced supplies had been wrecked. The news hit the Death Eater commanders hard. They'd been boasting to the Dark Lord only to suffer a public, humiliating defeat. Some argued they should conceal the loss until they'd taken savage revenge and then report it. Better to face Voldemort after redressing their honor. Bella agreed. She could not bear to disappoint the Dark Lord. They would withhold the report and prepare a counterattack within a day or two. The Ministry's morale rose at home. A clean, zero-casualty surprise attack was a rare victory. But internally, the Ministry still argued over larger strategy. Everyone agreed on resisting the Dark Lord, yet they split on how. The old British tendency towards small-scale skirmishes had been exposed as dangerous against an enemy willing to absorb massive losses. Should they concentrate and fight a decisive stand, risking heavy casualties but possibly winning, or should they abandon territory and fight a guerrilla war, preserving lives but sacrificing the public's will to resist? Ted's assistance via the magic net had proven its worth. With the net's support, a wizard's combat effectiveness could swell, some estimated by 50%, offsetting the enemy's numerical advantage. But victory still came at the price of manpower. Voldemort didn't care about human losses, he expected casualties. The Death Eaters were less fearful because the Dark Lord brooked no cowardice. The Black Mark made desertion a death sentence. The British wizards, with families and lives to protect, were far less willing to accept wholesale slaughter. The debate could not be settled by argument alone. Bella, fearful of losing face before Voldemort, made her decision for everyone. On November 3rd, she led a large force straight for the London Ministry of Magic. It was the sort of headlong, capital-strike boldness only a fanatic could love. Rather than methodically taking territory, she aimed to cut off the head and decapitate the enemy. On a Monday morning, her forces advanced like a black cloud over the city. Muggle authorities panicked and issued emergency evacuation orders, urging citizens to stay indoors and shelter. With that, and with goblins and other factions already mobilized, the Ministry of Magic's Offensive and Defensive Battle 2.0 had officially begun. Thanks to the book friends, user offline, and last 4 digits 0120 for 100 points of reward. Thank you. Chapter 448, The Ministry of Magic's Second Exile. There's a saying in gaming, that thing counters the expert. That line couldn't have been truer for Bella. The Ministry of Magic had launched a sneak attack and caught them mid-crossing, a small but meaningful victory. It was a good start. But while the two factions were still arguing about which route to take, with the neutral party trying to mediate, Bella had already rallied her forces and charged like a madwoman. "Sister, are you serious?" the Ministry's report crackled. "You just lost a battle. Your vanguard suffered 80 to 90% losses. Aren't you going to rest?" "No rest. I don't need it," Bella snapped. "So what if people die? I can spare them. The important thing is not to disappoint my master. Charge! Go!" It was Ted who discovered what was coming via the magical network, a large contingent of Death Eaters flying toward London on broomsticks. By the time he warned the Ministry, the Death Eaters had already set up a small teleportation array in the outskirts. They were running a teleportation raid at practically no cost. Teleporting a person normally cost more than 10 galleons, and they were not only teleporting wizards, they were bringing over hundreds of cannon fodder troops. And they kept teleporting. Ted thought fast and meddled with the array through the network. Mid-teleport, it began to click and sputter, then smoke and explode. When the cloud cleared, a troll was frozen halfway through. Only its front half had materialized. Ted could hardly believe what he saw. Worse, after a brief panic, Bella ordered, "Build a new teleportation array. Keep teleporting." "You've got to be kidding me," Ted muttered. Their wealth made it possible. They controlled nearly 10 countries, and the plunder they'd taken from the Ministry and Muggle society had lined their coffers. Rebuilding arrays and teleporting troops cost them little. Ted weighed his options and did nothing more. He could sabotage them further, but reconstruction took time the Ministry might use to respond. Besides, his ultimate target was Lord Voldemort. He needed the Death Eaters to press the attack, to gain a decisive advantage so that Voldemort would step in and fall into the trap Ted had prepared for the final confrontation. The earlier skirmishes were necessary sacrifices. Let the Ministry suffer. Let Voldemort take the blame. Even with the teleportation mishap, the Death Eaters' assault on London did not slow. They poured resources into redeeming that failure. 3 teams converged in the suburbs on broomsticks, set up another array, and began summoning masses of troops. Magical materials were burned through like water down a drain. In less than an hour, they had summoned over 200 wizards and more than 500 cannon fodder. They also exploited the Flu network and portkeys, channels the British Ministry tried to police but could not seal entirely, especially with traitors in the ranks. Given the organizational skill of the magical world, keeping an enemy entirely outside the border was impossible. But the British had not expected such a blunt, large-scale assault. Those tactics usually belonged to the weaker side. The Death Eaters were ignoring restraint altogether. London woke to chaos. Wizards, half awake, cursed and scrambled on robes, grabbed wands, potions, and prepared tools, and rushed toward the Ministry. The years of magic world battles in arenas and open PKs had changed them. Combat was no longer just wand work. People carried small trinkets, potions, and game-bought items. For a high price, Ted had opened a feature where one could summon followers from the game, essentially magic golems or alchemical servants. Ordinary wizards couldn't afford such luxuries, but many had bought a few defensive items for a few galleons. Wizards are fragile. A single damaging curse could be fatal. A little extra protection now meant extra lives. A death-defying necklace, for example, could block one killing curse from an ordinary wizard. There were items that reduced magical damage, healed wounds, and more. By 10:30 in the morning, a wave of 300 to 400 Death Eaters led by Bella charged toward the Ministry. They flew in a long line across the London sky like a spectacle. People in Muggle houses peered out their windows in disbelief. "So you're not hiding it anymore?" a Muggle muttered. "I knew there were angels in the world." Angels there might not have been. Villains certainly were. Mischievous Death Eaters blasted curses at gawking Muggles, instantly elongating a man's nose to a meter long, red and ridiculous. The Death Eaters in the sky hooted with laughter. Bella and her commanders let the taunting continue. There was a big battle coming. Tensions were high, and it was easy to vent on Muggles. After all, what did a few deaths matter? Neville, monitoring the advancing Death Eater unit on a holographic map, suddenly swore. Behind the flying line was another large contingent charging on the streets, monstrous troops pounding through traffic and over cars, saliva running and eyes hungry for terrified Muggles. If the dark arts that steered them hadn't held them in check, they'd already have started feasting. One driver, stuck in traffic, rolled down his window to shout and saw a hunched 2-meter troll leap from the car ahead and stomp his roof flat. The windshield exploded. He slumped back and made the sign of the cross with trembling hands. With monsters and Death Eaters moving openly through the city, secrecy was long gone. Thousands of muggles and magical folk witnessed the assault. Hundreds brushed past monsters in the streets. Bella was reckless, fixated on toppling the British ministry for praise from her master. The ministry's defenders were outnumbered. The frontline wizards fought in coordinated small squads, chaotic at first glance, but disciplined beneath. From above, it looked like the British had split the Death Eaters into many flanks, giving the attackers the impression of threats from all directions. Spells flew, alchemical bombs and thrown potions shattered the air, capture nets and enchanted artifacts flashed. The Death Eaters were caught off guard and suffered 20 or 30 casualties in the first engagement, but they held their ranks. Bella screamed orders in wild spells. "Advance! Anyone who retreats will taste the Cruciatus curse." Her curly hair streamed. Then the ground troops reached the fray. Bella touched the dark mark on her arm with her wand. The blood-red marks on the foreheads of the cannon fodder monsters flared. The serpentine's skull writhed, and the creatures howled in pain. "Charge! Kill them all!" she commanded. Driven by unbearable pain, the monsters surged toward the ministry's main gate. Dozens of wizards let loose area spells. Thunderous explosions followed by columns of fire. Rocks shattered and burst like landmines, shredding monsters to pieces. 30 to 40 of them were torn apart in an instant, and many more were grievously wounded. Still, the injured pressed on. A goblin with a blown-off leg crawled forward in a long, bloody trail. The Dark Mark's torment seemed to force them into the only relief it offered: obedience. They preferred to charge on than to stop. Even hardened combat veterans were shaken by the monster's disregard for death. Their bravery, or their madness, hit every wizard like a hammer. When the cannon fodder surge began to absorb the ministry's defensive fire, the Death Eaters renewed their assault. More monsters were teleported in from re-established arrays in the rear. Even with Ted's sabotages, explosions and missed teleports happened only about 1 in 9 times. But they did. Teleportation arrays broke down repeatedly. Fortune seemed to conspire against the defenders that day. After an hour of brutal fighting, the defenders were losing. The ministry's main gate had fallen. The plaza was buried under a heap of monster corpses a meter high. Nearly 1,000 monsters lay in a pile. The ministry's protective wards were shattered. The Death Eaters had relatively few losses and had achieved their objective. The battle had moved into the enemy's preferred rhythm: attrition by cannon fodder and the undead. The Ministry of Magic's architecture and wards were strong, but even the best defenses couldn't withstand endless waves of expendable attackers. Ted couldn't stand back and watch. He and over 30 seventh-year students phased in through a teleportation array. "We're here to help," he announced. Some inside wore weary skepticism. "You should retreat. There's nothing you can do," said Scrimger, who'd become head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement after Bones' promotion to minister. Bones was in the back, organizing evacuation. The ministry's fall seemed inevitable. Scrimger, an Auror and a hardliner, intended to hold the line and cover the retreat. In the original timeline, he had risen to Minister of Magic after Fudge. Here, his hatred of the Death Eaters had sharpened his resolve. Ted ignored the pleas and led his classmates to the front. A chain lightning leapt from his wand of destruction, a thunderous crack and a blue bolt that branched into 7 or 8 forks, arcing through a line of monsters. In an instant, 40 to 50 creatures were turned to smoking charcoal. A gap opened in the formation. Even experienced wizards paused. They had heard of Ted's unique lightning magic, but its raw power was astonishing. Hermione seized the moment, raising a 4-meter-high, 3-meter-thick wall of ice that sealed most of the main entrance, leaving only narrow gaps at the sides. Ted's companions cast in concert, exploding fireballs, ice spears, ice spheres, area grease combined with flame hands. The dozen or so young fighters were no less effective than 50 adult wizards. Their coordination and layered coverage shredded the charging monsters. Ted mostly switched to support, sweeping arcane wisdom, mana spring aura, large area evil protection, mana barrier, repelling fire rings. He intervened with destructive spells only when the Death Eaters tried to outflank or when reinforcements shoved through. He unleashed thunderous might when needed, dozens of lightning bolts from the sky frying monsters on impact and frying others through residual arcs. Gravity field disorder sent a cluster of goblin crossbowmen into the air as a writhing ball, then splattered them on the ground. He used item cards like Endless Pursuit Snowball, green, and an Extreme Effect Splitting Curse to blanket the field with hundreds of freezing snowballs that burst on contact, slowing and sometimes freezing smaller creatures. He also released Ansu and Softy. Softy cleared the field by consuming corpses and blocking charges, letting attackers hack at him before swallowing them. Ansu used clones, shadow strikes, cursed feathers, group dim vision, and ambush tactics, sniping Death Eaters in the rear. In 5 minutes, Ansu killed 3. 2 had their skull caps ripped off. Another was riddled with feathers. The arrival of Ted and the 7th Years bought the Ministry more than an hour. That extra time allowed a more orderly retreat. By late afternoon, even Bella's cannon fodder was running low, but the defenders were exhausted. The Ministry itself lay in ruin. Bella and the Death Eaters had boasted to Voldemort that they would topple the London Ministry in 3 days and the British magical establishment in a week. They didn't need 3 days. The Ministry fell on the afternoon of the 2nd. The price had been steep. Over 30 Ministry wizards had died, and 40 to 50 suffered severe injuries. Minor wounds would be treated quickly with potions and healing charms. The Death Eaters paid heavily as well. Over 70 of their number were dead in this siege, and more than 160 undead wizards they'd been using as cannon fodder were destroyed. The living cannon fodder monsters were largely wiped out, perhaps in the thousands, an amount hard to replenish quickly, though the Death Eaters still had undead to throw forward. One side had lost its seat of government but left the enemy bloodied. The other had seized the Ministry and suffered heavy casualties but could justify the costs to Voldemort. In either case, the British Ministry of Magic had effectively been exiled. The second exile had begun. Thanks to Reader listening to Rain Mountain Dweller for the 5,000-point reward, and to Reader I Am Offline for the 100-point reward. Thank you. Forward 72, The Calm Before the Storm. The fall of the Ministry of Magic also meant the fall of Diagon Alley and Nocturne Alley. Most shops in Diagon Alley were shuttered. Even Gringotts had closed its doors. Yet, a handful of establishments in Nocturne Alley stayed open clandestinely. Before long, Gringotts reopened, not under the usual British goblins, but under goblins from Eastern Europe who had sided with Lord Voldemort. Opportunists by nature, they knew that a closed bank would choke the economy and foil the Death Eaters' plans to profit. With galleons drying up, deflation loomed, so the goblins were sent in to get the vaults working again. Many Death Eaters took to forcing open other people's vaults. What's wrong with taking a little reward after serving the Dark Lord, they said. Vaults, however, were not easily breached. The blind dragon that guarded the underground caverns presented far more trouble than anyone expected. Previously controlled by a magical bell, it had been left unsupervised when the wizards fled, and no one could reach past it. 20-some Death Eaters and goblins tried to subdue that old blind creature and were beaten to a bloody pulp after 50 rounds. A later wave arrived with professional gear, dragon-slaying suits designed for dueling dragons. They finally killed the dragon and began prying open vaults. Ted had never trusted goblins or banks. He had kept his money with himself. Others were not so lucky. Although the Death Eaters had taken the Ministry like a hot knife through butter, they couldn't afford to press forward as recklessly as they had at first. The battle had been costly. Mobilizing foreign monsters or resurrecting the undead scattered across Britain couldn't be done overnight. Half the rewards promised to the troops had been handed out, and the humiliation of the earlier ambush had been avenged. So why risk everything now? Who dies for nothing? The boast of taking over all of Britain in 7 days had been a line the Dark Lord liked to hear. It wasn't taken literally. The Ministry had fallen. That was enough. Even Bellatrix couldn't forcibly compel her surviving followers to throw their lives away when the spoils were just beginning. People wanted to enjoy the victory. Besides, the Death Eaters were not a unified, ideologically consistent force. Lord Voldemort was a man of terror, extreme hatred of death, and few scruples, but he had not pondered the deeper organizational problems. He noticed the decay of the pure blood line, but didn't dwell on it. Grindelwald, safely hidden in Africa, had been cleverer rhetorically. In this perilous world, secure a path for the magic world to survive. Grand, monumental, and recruiting. Dumbledore and Ted had mainly feared Voldemort because he was relentless and unkillable. His lieutenants, the incompetent rabble, were less worrying. After the Ministry fell, its personnel retreated to Hogsmeade in the Scottish Highlands, the only other reliable gathering place left. The village became overwhelmed. There had been contingency plans, but no one had expected a loss so rapid. Hogsmeade suddenly swelled with 300 to 500 Ministry officials overnight, and wizards from the south fled there with their families. People knew what the Death Eaters had been like 15 years ago. Now that they had power, they would only grow worse. With Diagon Alley and Nocturne Alley occupied, Hogsmeade and Hogwarts were the last safe places. Huddling together felt like the only instinctual response. The village looked like the Quidditch World Cup. Tents of all sizes lined the streets, wizards shoved past each other, and families hurried about in confused, frightened clusters. Morale had taken a blow. The Death Eaters might be too depleted to attack immediately, but that simply meant they would attack later. If they had failed now, could they succeed after regrouping? The prospect made many grimly pessimistic. Across the globe, nearly 1 million wizards watched Britain struggle through the magic net utopia. If Britain fell, what hope would remain for France, Spain, or beyond? The Magical Congress in America held an emergency meeting overnight. Talk dominated, action delayed. Officials reassured themselves that at worst they would become administrators under the Dark Lord. Someone would have to manage the territories, after all. Minister Bones and other officials frantically contacted every faction and magical race in hope of uniting every available force. Giants were a priority. Not many in Britain, fewer than 500, split into a dozen tribes, prone to violence, stubborn and greedy, unreliable and quarrelsome. The Death Eaters had been as diligent in courting the giants as the Ministry. They supported pro-Dark Lord claimants, bribed with supplies, and used influence to sway tribes. Giants loved food, and the Death Eaters, with their influence in the Muggle world, had abundant supplies, stacks of meat and bread that proved persuasive. Other groups posed different problems. Werewolves were less of a concern. Under Ted's plans, half of Europe's werewolves lived integrated in Muggle society, working in factories, malls, and security companies. Ted had quelled earlier unrest and stabilized them. Vampires were few and traditional. Perhaps 100 strong ones remained in Britain, with only a couple reaching truly dangerous levels. British goblins were old and depleted. Those at Gringotts now were foreigners. Centaurs were infuriatingly independent. They despised both the Ministry and the Death Eaters and would not submit to either side. Merpeople stayed in their waters and left land politics alone, though Ellie, the merperson studying at Hogwarts, gave the school a friendly leaning. The Boarmen were xenophobic and unpredictable. No one could say where their loyalties would lie. Dwarves, gnomes, and the folk of Ironhammer Fortress would never side with the Death Eaters, and elves would turn their faces at the sight of Voldemort. Demi-humans, with animalistic features, had long been targets of Death Eater malice. They were unlikely to cooperate with Voldemort. Over the next days, Ted met with leaders and representatives and coordinated contributions. Hogsmeade became a 24-hour construction site. Hogwarts professors and students pitched in. Magic fortifications went up. Wards were strengthened, and defensive enchantments were woven into buildings. Some children still attended lessons while their parents labored outside the school gates, awaiting the inevitable showdown. Even before battle resumed, a tragic mood had settled over everyone. Ted, originating from the Heavenly Dynasty, organized the information war. Death Eaters flaunted their cruelty on the magic net. Videos of raids, of broken shops, of captured wizards. They reveled in the display of power. Ted flipped the narrative. He highlighted the Death Eaters' arrogance and brutality. The world would end under them. Resistance was the only defense of family and home. He offered practical aid through Ideal Land, trade functions for potions and artifacts, temporary magical replenishment, trace hiding, full map reveals. In 3 days, over 1,000 wizards used the exchange, and the Death Eaters' efforts were hampered. Those planted as moles found their work dangerous. Exposure meant beatings or worse. With the net showing the full map, cutting through the fog of war, Death Eater missions were often ambushed. Teams of local wizards disrupted supplies, sabotaged contacts with giants, rescued captured families. The Death Eaters made no real progress for over 10 days. Even so, Eastern Europe kept sending fresh dark wizards, cannon fodder, and necromantic creatures, for Voldemort's lieutenants were eager and accustomed to guessing his moods. At Hogwarts, Ted met daily with many people. He was in constant contact with Neville Longbottom. With another major clash looming, Neville was bound to be a key figure. He also had a lingering problem with his body that needed resolution. One evening, Ted summoned Neville to the covered bridge. They watched students streaming out after dinner to work on Hogsmeade's defenses. The two stood in silence for a long time, remembering how unimaginable it had once been that undergraduates would be called to war. "Ted," Neville said at last, or rather he was about to speak, when Ted suddenly broke the quiet. "Neville, do you remember when you first enrolled, how your scar hurt after Snape looked at you, and later you found it was because of Professor Quirrell?" Neville stared. The memory raced back, the face on the back of Quirrell's head, Lord Voldemort, and the moment he'd pressed that face, turning Quirrell to ash. Neville was not the chubby, naive boy of years past. He had become a leader who charged first and retreated last. He had thought of many things since those days. Ted's tone was grave as he said slowly, "There is a connection between you and Lord Voldemort, a very important connection." 73. Tzeentch's Thread of Destiny, Bloodline. Neville sat alone in a small garden on the school grounds, fingers tracing the raised scar on his forehead. It had once been a symbol, glory, a sign of his parents' sacrifice, the living proof of his link to Lord Voldemort. For a long time he had believed he had shed the labels, the boy who lived, the savior. People no longer came to him seeking courage from that mark. They knew him now, Neville Longbottom, the boy who had defeated the Dark Lord. He had never expected that the past could not be escaped. Fragments of Voldemort's soul lingered in his mind. Neville himself had become an unwilling Horcrux. While he lived, a part of Voldemort would not die. Had his life been a mistake from the start? His parents had given everything for him, only for him to be the one who might have to die. He exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. Snowflakes drifted down, sudden and early. Was it already late November? Weather had been erratic these past 2 years, and this winter seemed to have arrived ahead of time. Hogwarts could temper the climate around its grounds after successive renovations, but the wider world was changing too quickly. What would happen after Voldemort was gone? More trials could be coming. But that was not Neville's concern. His duty was singular. "Being sentimental doesn't solve anything," he murmured. Years of hardship had hardened the awkward, plump boy into a man. He would accept his fate and do what needed to be done, just as Dumbledore had prepared others to do. Death is only another journey. But what about Ginny? Guilt gnawed at him. She had given so much for him over the years, and though their first meeting had left him flustered, she had stood by him. He had less than a month to act. Ted's estimate put the final battle before the new year. The soul fragment had to be dealt with before they faced Voldemort. Neville closed his eyes. "Ginny, I'm sorry," he whispered. That evening he found Ted. "I'll resolve the soul fragment," Neville said. "You all must make sure he's finished." Ted nodded. Only he, Snape, and Neville knew the truth of what would happen. Dumbledore had confided his plans to Snape before he died. When Snape learned of Neville's choice, he sat in silence for a long time. Then, in a voice that had been buried for years, he erupted. "If that old man Dumbledore hadn't died, that child wouldn't have to make this choice," Snape spat. He had been quiet for a long time, but the restraint finally broke. His hate for Voldemort and the Death Eaters, his torment over Lily's death, his self-loathing for having followed a dark wizard, years of suppressed grief and guilt had become unbearable. Magic surged from him in a violent gust. Invisible blades of force shredded the air and nearly tore the office apart. Then, as quickly as it had flared, the storm within him stilled. His face fell back into its pale, lined calm. "My mission is not yet complete," he said softly. "I must kill Voldemort and make these sacrifices mean something." Across the castle, Harry had pushed Draco back against a wall, concern and frustration in his voice. "Are you hiding something from me?" "How could I?" How could I hide anything from you? Draco stammered, searching for an answer. You've been distracted for 2 months, Harry said. Whatever it is, we're together. We face it together. Whatever the difficulty, whatever Lord Voldemort throws at us. All Draco's ready explanations fell away. He hugged Harry, voice small but steady. I know, we'll face it together. In Hogsmeade, a small house sheltered a whispered meeting between Jerry and Sherry. Many of the demi-human villages had sent their best to aid the defense. If Voldemort won, their people would be devastated. They were not fighting for wizards alone, but for survival. Sherry peppered Jerry with questions about shadow rogue techniques. He answered patiently. Thoughts of his worried mother back home weighed on Jerry as he stared northward, as if he could see through stone to London. He could not fail. He must protect them all. Farther down the road, Ron adjusted a monocle-like device, something like a Dragon Ball scouter, calibrating the parameters of the first magic-powered machine and tending the runic array etched along its frame. Penelope complained through his headphones about logistics in Hogsmeade. She managed supply chains for the ministry and was fraying at the edges. Ron cleaned oil and grime from his hands with a summoned cloth, then stood before the towering 8-meter prototype and whispered, Old friend, it's up to you. We can't lose. In the Slytherin dungeons, the mood was awkward. The entire school and the British magical community had mobilized for a final confrontation, but Slytherin students found themselves in an uncomfortable position. 20 years ago, many pureblood families had aligned with the Death Eaters. The pureblood rhetoric had left deep roots. Some Slytherins had eagerly followed anyone in power before, but now the truth of Voldemort's methods was plain. Foreign dark wizards and monsters imported into Britain, rivers of blood, the ministry driven into Hogsmeade, and a campaign of assassination and sabotage. In the last 10 days, Hogsmeade had endured 6 attacks, killings and acts of sabotage attributed to Death Eater operatives. Those caught included zealots, coerced locals, and foreign dark wizards. The Death Eater ranks had fractured into factions. Die-hard fanatics like Bella, British pure-blood traditionalists, absorbed foreign dark wizards, opportunists who used chaos to enrich themselves, and the strange alliances with goblin or other magical race groups. Even before victory was assured, they were scheming over spoils. Many Slytherin students now loathed what Lord Voldemort and his followers had become, but expressing that hatred was risky. How could anyone be believed when family names and histories stained reputations? Suspicion and whispered accusations ate at them from inside their own house. In the headmistress's office, Professor McGonagall set down a freshly signed document, removed her spectacles, and let out a long, weary sigh. The months since the ministry battle had been brutal, organizing defenses, supporting Ted's group to buy time, shoring up the Hogsmeade front, directing students in construction and logistics. She bore a terrible responsibility. Was it right to involve children in a war? But to do nothing might condemn them to even worse futures. She finally understood the weight Dumbledore had carried for years. Professor, the ministry representative is here about tomorrow's frontline array changes, Flitwick said from the crystal ball on her desk. I know. I'll be there, she replied, shoulders straightening. Whatever came, she had to hold firm and be an example. At 11 that night, Ted finished his work at the secret base and intended to comb through the magical network logs for any new Death Eater plots. He had been watching the recent attacks. That was why most had failed. He had planned countermeasures and even freed wizards held in a temporary Death Eater prison to stop them from being used as leverage. Hermione did not return to the dormitory that night. She met him in the common room. Why are you waiting up? He asked. I worried you hadn't eaten. Hermione waved her wand and several plates and cups appeared on the coffee table. Ted had already eaten, but accepted the food with a smile. Hermione, will we win? She asked, voice uncertain. Ted set his jaw and smiled. We will win. Then winter truly came. Heavy snow fell overnight, and the grounds were buried in white. As Ted scrolled through the magical network, a notification pinged into his vision. Ding. Talent Otherworld Knowledge Gold triggered. Discovered Tzeentch's Loom of Fate orange. The entry described Tzeentch, the most changeable and cunning of the 4 Chaos Gods. Once associated with hope and wisdom, his nature had been twisted. His hope fed on victims' despair and their desperate struggles. His wisdom was an endless calculus of conspiracy. He wove mortals' fates like tapestry, favoring those who displayed extraordinary calculation. The knowledge promised mastery of fate itself, but demanded 660,666 experience points to unlock. Ted skimmed the description, felt the chill that always accompanied anything tied to Tzeentch, and dismissed it. No matter how tempting, don't touch anything from Tzeentch. He calculated by making you think you were special. Ted closed the window and moved on. At the same time, Voldemort was moving in the opposite direction, reorganizing power from the shadows. Old British pureblood diehards had raised the slogan again, "Shouldn't the purebloods rise to greatness?" Voldemort, experimenting in necromancy and odd magics, indulged them. A new department was created in the new ministry, the Office for the Purification of Bloodlines. Its remit was to classify wizards by ancestry. Purebloods who did not oppose the regime were fine. Willing converts could expect reward. Half-bloods would be vetted and surveilled. Muggleborns fared worst. They were to be locked in Azkaban and forced into magical production. 3 days after the office opened, Voldemort dug up an early experiment from his past, even pulling in bits of Professor Quirrell's old research. The office announced a grand scheme, a program to purify the populace by transforming Muggles into wizards so that wizards would be masters of the world. The declaration caused an uproar. Becoming a wizard seemed like a blessing to many. But Ted went to the office himself, cloaked beneath the cover of the magical network. Nothing in the department's defenses flagged him. Either Voldemort's men had a blind spot, or this was deliberate. Inside, he ran into an old, despised acquaintance, Dolores Umbridge. She had been released from Azkaban and installed as an assistant in the Office for the Purification of Bloodlines. Ted found her presence abhorrent as ever. Under her supervision, he found internal documents and experimental data that made his blood run cold. According to Voldemort's early trials, the bloodline transformation could, in theory, imbue Muggles with wizardry, but the cost was horrendous. The success rate was 3 in 1,000. The rest died. Some of the survivors were twisted into monsters. Even if every human on Earth underwent the procedure, fewer than 20 million might survive as wizards. The rest would be corpses or abominations. It was genocide disguised as salvation. Chapter 474, The Undead Stop. Although Lord Voldemort had become fixated on understanding the boundary between life and death, on mastering life and death itself, he remained, at heart, the Dark Lord. Everything he did reeked of malice. The latest scheme, the Bloodline Purification Plan, was outrageous. A 0.3% success rate? That was practically a death sentence for humanity. If the goal was mass elimination, there would be no need for celestial alignments or alien interventions. You could just wipe people out directly. Yet, disturbingly, the idea had intrigued many Muggles and wizards alike. Even inside Hogwarts, students were talking about it. Under Ted's guidance, the younger students weren't so easily taken in. When a topic came up, their first question was never what, but who proposed it. Voldemort and the Death Eaters pushing a bloodline purification program sounded suspicious, and most of the little wizards expressed cautious distrust. That they could question authority was a sign of progress. In this internet age, blind credulity was dangerous. Critical thinking mattered. Ted's subtle influence kept the student body level-headed. Outside the school, however, things were far more chaotic. In the wider magic world, and in Muggle society, powerful interests were restless. Within days, an American multinational biotech firm approached the Death Eaters asking to buy the technology. The Death Eaters had never faced this before. Sell the technology? Could such a thing even be sold? But the idea had appeal. Selling the technique would allow Muggles to pursue purification themselves, faster than doing it piecemeal. More importantly, it promised huge profits. Even if they didn't gain the full spoils, there would be plenty of grease for many hands. There was a grave counter-argument, though. This was Voldemort's technology. If he discovered you were selling it, you might be subjected to the Cruciatus Curse, or worse. The Dark Lord was notoriously volatile. Many people's lives could hang in the balance. So the Death Eaters debated. On the Muggle side, a cohort of elderly tycoons and life extension clients were desperate. They had already paid fortunes for potions and treatments, but mortality still loomed. If only I could become a wizard and live 100 or 200 years. They urged their representatives, persuade the Dark Lord, acquire this bloodline purification technology. They were willing to risk everything. For those with unlimited wealth, the value of any sliver of hope outweighed the cost of human lives discarded as necessary losses. The gulf between the privileged and ordinary people had never been clearer. Ted learned that a dozen or more international forces were already negotiating with the Death Eaters, and many more were circling. Even in Britain, where the Queen and the Prime Minister leaned toward the Ministry of Magic, temptation lingered. Some prominent figures were still eager. If becoming a wizard meant living past 100, who wouldn't want that? The thought of the Death Eaters trading the technology to foreign powers terrified Ted. He acted. His first move was to seek out Gellert Grindelwald, the first-generation Dark Lord, and ask for help. Grindelwald listened to the experimental data Ted had, then frowned. A 0.3% success rate, high probability of death, and a chance the subject could turn into a monster. This looked like a failed experiment. Yet Voldemort insisted it was usable. Grindelwald's contempt for such madness was clear. Truly insane, he said, and offered to act. With Grindelwald taking the lead, Ted could stay hidden a while longer. 2 days later, Grindelwald struck at a covert transaction in Spain. 2 American contingents were meeting the Death Eaters to bid on the bloodline purification tech. The Death Eaters had thought to pit them against each other or broker a deal. Grindelwald did not negotiate. He slaughtered the assembled Death Eaters, the so-called superhumans, and the dinosaur gene-modified operatives in one sweeping strike. Among the buyers were Vought International, the firm behind many of America's super potions, and Fessenden Genetic Programming Company, which trafficked in dinosaur gene modifications and had ties to shadowy networks. Ted had known little about them before. Now their involvement with the Death Eaters confirmed the threat was broader than expected. After the raid, Grindelwald went public. He opened a live account on the Ideal Land Forum, released all the bloodline purification experiment data, and condemned Voldemort's madness. The leak cut the Gordian knot. That technology, with such a low success rate, was effectively useless in the short term. The immediate international scramble cooled. The bloodline purification plan was stillborn, for now. But that madness had already stoked a wider fury. Teachers, students, and the wizarding community were incensed. Ted stepped forward to lead. For more than 10 years, he said in a speech that spread across the network, "Lord Voldemort and the Death Eaters have ravaged the magic world. Families shattered, wizards killed, fathers, husbands, and sons lost. Now they return, stronger than ever. They invade nations, force wizards into submission, enslave magical creatures, and command monsters to attack both wizards and muggles. They bring pain and death. Must we simply surrender and live under that constant threat? Absolutely not. Life is precious, and when someone tries to take our freedom, we will fight with our lives." He called for unity across national and racial lines. Even muggles who dare to roar at evil are comrades in arms, and repeated a promise: Lord Voldemort will be defeated. He concluded the broadcast by singing Legends Never Die, the 2017 League of Legends World Championship theme. Ted activated his voice of heart, red talent, pouring everything into his singing to move his listeners. The speech and the song ignited confidence across the school and beyond. His prominence, already built from representing the Order of the Phoenix, his performance in the Triwizard Tournament, and the creation of the Magic Net Utopia, was now cemented. To some, it even looked like Dumbledore might be nudging him forward as a new leader of the younger generation, a plan to keep him from becoming another dark figure. Faint or not, the effect was real. Grindelwald's public denunciation and Ted's open defiance infuriated Voldemort. The Dark Lord would not sit quietly. The Death Eaters, who had been bickering and scheming, now moved with ruthless coordination. Small skirmishes were no longer enough. It was time for war. Over the past month, the Death Eaters had rebuilt much of their strength. New necromantic creations, undead wizards and monsters from Voldemort's experiments, arrived in droves. They pushed north, sweeping through towns and driving back ministry forces. In less than 3 days, they reached the Scottish Highlands. The ministry and allied forces, wizards, Other races and Hogwarts students mustered around 600 defenders, a number that matched the Death Eaters in the field but was only a fraction of the enemy's reserves. The Death Eaters had more in the wings. This time, Bella was not in direct command, but the Death Eaters had teleportation arrays, and they began to use them without regard for losses. Teleporting thousands of monsters was expensive, and for some, the expense was part of the plan. Where would the Death Eaters get money if not from these operations? But the arrays were unstable. For every 10 monsters teleported, 2 or 3 were lost in the process. By afternoon, heaps of half-destroyed creatures lay strewn where teleportation rifts spit them out. Unknown to the Death Eaters, Ted had tampered to reduce how many troublesome monsters survived the transit. Despite the losses, by noon, the arrays had transmitted the main force. Over 800 Death Eaters, dark wizards and undead wizards landed, accompanied by more than 6,000 assorted monster cannon fodder. 200 of those monsters were elite: giants, trolls, ogres, and strong orcs, creatures far beyond what most wizarding defenders could handle easily. The Ministry had only a few dozen elite combat wizards, and while more than 600 defenders might look comparable numerically, the enemy's depth and the undead's expendability made the situation grim. The Death Eaters' plan was straightforward: send the undead forward, then swarm with monsters, then let the wizards strike from air and ground. Hogsmeade could be erased in an instant. A Death Eater stood on a massive flying carpet, looking down at the endless tide of monsters and cadavers. "Gentlemen," he said, "shouldn't we attack?" Bella waved impatiently. "Kill." Her single command, amplified by dark magic, echoed for miles. The blue soul fires in the eye sockets of the undead flared, and the skeletons and zombies began to lumber forward toward Hogsmeade. In Hogsmeade, Minister Bones and the defenders gripped their wands and palms, sweat on their brows. Their preparations had been long and careful, but the sudden surge of undead threatened to squander their defenses. If they burned their heavy ordnance on these corpses, what would they do when the real monsters arrived? At that moment, Ted stepped forward. "Neville?" he called. Neville Longbottom nodded. "Yes, I understand." They could not afford to waste the power of their large magical arrays. Those would need to be saved for later. Neville raised his wand. "Expecto Patronum, Holy Sword Manifest." A brilliant golden light bloomed from his wand, forming a magnificent sword, Neville's Patronus. Like Ted's Patronus, this one was abnormal. From the sword's tip, a pillar of golden holy light shot into the clouds. Ted launched himself into the sky, deftly guiding the beam into his hand. He raised it, and the holy light melted into a protective magical shield. The shield expanded to encompass a 5-kilometer radius around Hogsmeade, like an inverted bowl of golden energy. Ted did not stop there. He spoke a string of spells: evil protection, heroism, endure pain, cure light wounds, aura of glory. He layered more than a dozen enhancement enchantments onto the shield, each flowing seamlessly into the next. The final incantation he spoke was the most unusual: Undead Stop. Borrowing the holy light of Neville's Patronus, Ted completed the enhancement of the entire protective array. Allied units within the dome were instantly buffed by those dozen-plus spells. Ted floated above the town, the golden shield beneath his feet, his magic pulsing like a storm. Even seasoned wizards were stunned. He was only 17, yet his power loomed like that of a young Dark Lord. The undead didn't know fear. They surged into the golden dome as commanded. The shield did not physically block them, but once they passed inside, the death magic that animated them began to dissipate. 20 steps in, the nearest ones crumbled into dust and dry bones. The spell, and the holy light that fueled it, neutralized the undead's animating force. For the defenders, that moment was a turning point. The tide of cheap cannon fodder had been stopped. The battle was not over. The monsters and elite units still posed a grave threat, but the dead no longer had the advantage of sheer numbers. Ted's shield and the Undead Stop spell had bought the defenders time and hope. 475. Neville died in battle. Hermione, by manipulating the entire Hogsmeade defensive array, unleashed a massive combined wind and fire spell, a fire tornado. A slim pillar of flame, 30 to 40 meters high, rolled across the battlefield, its scorching winds sweeping everything in its path. Monsters within 10 meters fled in panic, but if they crossed its boundary, they were dragged in and consumed, burned to ashes. Harry manifested two blue, spectral arms over a meter thick, gripping a giant spiked club more than 6 meters long. One swing carved a trench in the earth. 7 or 8 monsters were smashed to pulp, a fat ogre in rough armor among them, and a dozen smaller beasts were hurled away by the impact. The sight was like the Monkey King smashing demons with his golden cudgel. Jerry moved across the field with eerie ease. Time and again he appeared behind charging foes no matter how many spells struck him. He would tap his wand lightly on a monster's back, vanish, and the creature would freeze, then collapse like a falling mountain. Ron was even more dazzling. He slapped a knight's guide belt onto his waist. Magical runes spread across him, and a suit of knightly armor formed, enveloping him. With flashy moves, props, and tactics, he fought 10 monsters at once, and still had energy to spare, making the younger students behind him burn with envy. Rumors said some had tried to replicate the knight's belts, but none were like this. As more monsters surged, Ron leaped, spreading his limbs into a great X in midair. The phantom of the first machine materialized around him, and the machine itself coalesced. The way he mounted it was breathtaking. 6 jet-like wings erupted from its back, spewing blue flame and leaving a long trail as it swept across the battlefield, followed by explosions, smoke, and fire. The first machine stood 8 meters tall, packed with magic-guided tech, enchanted items, and alchemical bombs, ideal for this scale of battle. It was a dimensionality reduction strike. The tallest enemy was a 5-meter siege ogre, clearly the product of cruel experiments, rock-like skin, impervious to blades, and a magic resistance of level 6. Any wizard below Professor or Elite Auror level could not affect it. Yet Ron cut it in half with a magic-guided high-frequency light blade. The 3-meter-wide wound steamed and sealed instantly. No blood flowed. It was cauterized on the spot. Still, the brightest presence on the field was Neville. His body was bathed in golden light that roared like fire, spreading out over the ground like a golden river and blessing the allied lines. In one hand his wand had become a golden holy blade. In the other he carried the sword of Gryffindor. Tall and agile, he moved like a dual-wielding blade master, charging into monster ranks, leaping, slaying with each stroke, cutting a swath through the battlefield. Undead fell before him like grass under a scythe. Death Eaters and dark wizards tried ambush spells, but their magic dissipated in his golden radiance, powerless to touch him. Neville kept a special breathing rhythm, his whole being on the verge of becoming pure light. He poured himself completely into the fight, and that devotion fueled his magic beyond his limits. He fought at something like 120%. Bellatrix and the others commanding from the sky watched in fury and something like fear. The boy the prophecy had marked, this golden boy, had grown into a force that made them uneasy. Though they had once ruled over the magical world, facing him now felt different. A name casts a long shadow. Everyone remembered the boy who lived, who had once saved Britain's magical world. In the sky, Ted managed the array, rescuing disadvantaged wizards and coordinating the students' joint casting. From time to time, he unleashed large-scale effects, lightning, explosive fireballs, earth fissures that broke monster charges. The Hogwarts students fought remarkably well. No longer disorganized, they formed unified joint castings. Combined thunderous explosions and blazing infernos spanned tens of meters and produced results rivaling, at times surpassing, adult and ministry wizards. Other races, subhumans, dwarves, gnomes, centaurs, and elves, joined under the array's blessing and cut down charging monsters. The fight that began at dawn raged into the afternoon. The dark-controlled monsters began to falter. The more than 3,000 undead were annihilated. With the array's suppression and Neville's sweeping holy light, in less than an hour, they were reduced to piles of bones and corpses. The Death Eaters and Dark Wizards didn't suffer massive officer casualties, but their expendables had been used up. The Hogsmeade array, built around the entire village, had been too strong. Death Eater cannon fodder smashed against it like waves on a reef. They didn't fear losses, but losing so many with so little effect chafed Bellatrix and her commanders. This was harder than fighting the Ministry. Bellatrix paced anxiously in the forward command tent, eyes bloodshot. "No. We must find a way to kill those 2 brats," she snarled. She had a bad premonition that these two, Neville and the boy who lived, would be a dangerous influence on their master's plans. Even if all their cannon fodder died, those two had to be eliminated. She raged, obsessed. I don't care. I want those two dead. Not all Death Eaters shared her recklessness. The defensive shell around Hogsmeade was solid, and the new generation of fighters, especially the students, had proven unexpectedly capable. How could they break it? Spells on the shield only created ripples, but the strongest fortresses were often broken from within. The wiser among them suggested using hidden pieces long cultivated inside Britain. No time to lose. Activate the moles tonight. Break the shell and take the targets. They sent a message. They want me to cooperate in destroying the core of the defensive array, someone said. Be careful, came the reply. I have all my life-saving charms, but do we abandon Hogsmeade? There's no choice. We can kill monsters, but if Lord Voldemort survives, it's all for nothing. Draco's phantom faded from Ted's room, and another phantom took its place. They want us to open a passage when chaos begins. Their targets are likely key figures. Ted nodded. Do as they say. Be careful. Understand. You two be careful. After reconnecting with Parker and scanning the magic net, Ted pondered. Everything was moving toward the final confrontation with Voldemort. 3 against 1 gave them the advantage. If Snape had a plan, he had better not be bluffing. A mistake now could let Voldemort revive elsewhere and escape them forever. Ted felt the weight of Dumbledore's old responsibilities. So many lives and hopes hinged on the plans he now helped execute. One wrong word could cause countless deaths. Late December brought deep winter. Nights were short and black. At midnight, a wolf howl cut through the silence. Werewolves Ted had recruited guarding the perimeter. Their bloodline traits made them more alert at night, ideal sentries against raids. Inside Hogsmeade's clock tower, an alarm bell tolled urgently. The protective array activated and a shield rose. Above it, a huge ball of light 10 meters across burned in the sky, turning the night into day for miles. The Death Eaters launched a night raid. There were far fewer monsters than in daylight, but they were elite, level 10 and above, and many bore green glowing eyes, creatures adapted to night. Dark shapes with a red flash were vampires. Voldemort had conquered regions like Albania and Romania and subjugated vampire families. Vampires were not cannon fodder. They were a sentient, respected magical race. Bellatrix and other commanders, desperate to placate their master, had thrown them in. Britain had its own vampire families and bloodline houses who resisted Voldemort. They joined the defense. Ted, Bell, Snape, Sirius, Lupin, and others had worked to improve Wolfsbane, solving many problems of werewolf transformation, madness, and contagion. Artificial blood had eased their sustenance. They still could not tolerate sunlight, but the chance to live freely was worth fighting for. Vampires clashed first with local bloodline families and werewolves. The fight was brutal and bloody. The Death Eaters' sneak attack was swift, but Hogsmeade's defenses held. Wizards rushed out of their homes, cursing the audacity of a night assault after such a bloody day. A team entered the protective shield by magical token, guided by a young figure. Bellatrix and 7 or 8 elite Death Eaters were spirited in with their faces covered. Draco watched as 2 magical nodes in the village flickered and then went out. He cursed inwardly. There were more moles than he'd known. The Death Eaters moved through the village and finally cornered Neville, who had not withdrawn. Hogwarts students should have returned to school, but Ted and others had stayed. Bellatrix Lestrange, Neville said with restrained calm as she approached. Of the 7 who had killed his parents, Bellatrix was the only one left alive. Bellatrix sneered. Longbottom's brat. Go to hell. For the Dark Lord. Those who rushed Neville were elite Death Eaters, 7 in all, 4 of them specialists. They had planned to kill both Neville and Ted, but realized heading straight for Ted was too risky. They decided to take out the strong enemy, the Golden Boy, first. The prophecy had named him. Belief and orders drove them to attack. The protective shield had been breached from within. Monsters and Death Eaters flooded the village and chaos erupted. Less than 15 minutes into the skirmish, a black mark shot into the sky. The raiding Death Eaters seemed to receive a signal and began to retreat in a panic, as if whoever lagged behind would be abandoned. Dark clouds coalesced and lightning struck like falling dumplings. targeting Death Eaters across a wide area. Every second seemed to take another Death Eater down in a fireball. This was not natural lightning. It was Ted's large-scale magic. He stood with his back to the giant ball of light, a great shadow cast over the field, guiding thunderbolts to hammer the retreating raiders. Along the kilometer-long flight path, over 100 Death Eaters were struck down by concentrated lightning. The monsters on the ground, running on 2 legs, could not escape. In a short time, including people and creatures, 400, nearly 500, lay dead. Bellatrix and 2 survivors teleported back to their command with a portkey. 4 of their number had died, but their mission had partly succeeded. One Death Eater attempted to explain why so few of the raiding party survived, but at the thought of Ted's thunderous shadow in the sky, he could not say the boy's name. Fear had hollowed him out. Meanwhile, Ministry teams cleared the battlefield and retreated to Hogwarts. Hogsmeade was ruined, a third of its buildings damaged, the array shattered, 30 or 40 dead. They could not hold the village. They fell back to the last castle. On the school viaduct, Hagrid staggered forward, carrying Neville as if he were a child. The crowd that had been anxiously waiting surged. Neville was dead. Bellatrix had struck him down with the killing curse. The golden boy was gone. Ted, what happened to Neville? Ron trembled, pale as a corpse, unable to accept it. Jerry reached out to check for a pulse. Neville's skin was icy. He tried again, blowing on his hand to wake himself from some dream, still cold. Desperate, Jerry muttered that it must be an illusion. Ted rifled through Neville's robes and found the amulet he had specially made for him. Relief washed over him, small, sharp, and controlled. He said quietly, "Don't worry, Neville has to face a difficult challenge alone now." He drew a crystal orb from his pack, placed it on Neville's chest, and guided Neville's hand around it. He hoped it would help. The moment the orb touched him, Neville found himself in a vast white space. 476. This child cannot be kept. A vast whiteness stretched in every direction, so complete that north, south, east, and west meant nothing. Distance had no edges. The immediate surroundings were indistinct. The place gave Neville a dizzy, indecisive feeling. He looked around, bewildered. Didn't I die? He remembered the killing curse, Bellatrix's green beam, striking his chest, his life draining away, his soul beginning to lift free. He had gone there intending to die, to use the Death Eaters as a means to end himself and remove Voldemort's last Horcrux. He had even hoped, selfishly, to take Bellatrix with him. But she had been cruelly pragmatic. When she discovered Neville's unexpectedly strong defense, she sacrificed one of her own. As Neville attacked a Death Eater, a twin-cast spell first tore into that companion, and then a green bolt drove through the wound into Neville. She'd done it because he'd already killed several of them. "Fair trade, I suppose," Neville muttered, looking down at his hands. His wand was gone, but he still wore his Hogwarts robe. So he was dead? In a soul state? He wasn't certain. "You are dead, Longbottom," said a voice. "Who?" Neville sprang to alertness, peering into the empty white. The voice was female and unfamiliar. As he listened, he felt something in his robe pocket. He fumbled and pulled out a small bead, the talisman Ted had told him to keep close. How had it ended up here? If Neville had been back home, he might have muttered about burial coins or rites. The bead trembled, and then it uncoiled into a thin, greenish snake. Neville nearly dropped it. "Hello, Neville Longbottom," the little snake said, flicking its tongue. "Ted sent me. My name is Nagini." Neville's mind scrambled. Nagini? He'd heard Hermione speak about that woman's tragic past. How was she a snake here? You died too?" he asked. The snake wrapped itself around his finger. "I didn't die. My soul left my body. My body is a snake. That complicates returning. But my memories and humanity have come back. I found myself here once, so Ted sent me to help you." Neville swallowed. He knew a good deal: breathing techniques, holy light magic, herbology, combat, but not Ted's fields. Ted's work on souls, the shadow domain, Ron's arcane devices, the machine soul research, these were over his head. "So this talisman," he began. "It shields your soul," Nagini said. "The killing curse forced your soul out, but the charm kept it whole. If we can leave here, you can be reborn." "Leave here how?" Neville asked desperately. He wanted to live. His friends, his classmates, Ginny, he could not leave them. Nagini's tongue flicked. "We have to move." "Move where?" "Anywhere. Staying still will not work." Here direction has no meaning. If we walk, we will go somewhere. I've done this before, so I know. Come. All he wanted now was to be back, so Neville picked a direction and began to walk. He talked with Nagini as they went, about her experience, about what he had missed, while the white scenery shifted, or maybe it didn't. Time lost its usual shape. Back in the real world, the battle had not stopped. If anything, it had escalated. Hogsmeade's defenses had been broken and the village occupied. Only Hogwarts remained unconquered in Britain. Casualties had been enormous. Unlike most engagements, the Death Eaters themselves had taken terrible losses. Undead troops and disposable monsters had always been cheap, but Death Eaters were Voldemort's hand-picked followers. Heavy losses among them were a blow to pride as well as strength. The Ministry, though driven back to the school, had emerged with relatively light losses. That made the Death Eaters' losses even more shameful. Voldemort was furious. He grumbled that a few rotten apples had yielded such a casualty rate. His rage boiled into complaints about incompetence. Then Bella announced she had killed Neville Longbottom. Voldemort's mood shifted. He still complained that she'd robbed him of the pleasure of ending Neville himself, but killing such an enemy pleased him. He put aside talk of casualties for the moment. Still, he wanted to know how so many of his men had died. The wizarding spellcraft had no comparable artillery. What had cut down his troops? He examined the memories of a surviving Death Eater. In those memories, Ted floated above the battlefield, like some god or demon, a corona of light behind him, and lightning running between his clenched hands. Bolts rained down, striking Death Eater and monster alike. It looked like divine punishment. Voldemort stared at it in stunned silence. Ted's performance was overwhelming, intimidating to the bone. He was only 17 and already terrifying. In a few years, Voldemort thought, this boy might reach Dumbledore's level. He could not allow another rival to grow. He felt an ugly, immediate urge: eliminate him. When Voldemort growled that this child must not be allowed to live, the Death Eaters trembled. Bella had been a reckless madwoman. Voldemort's fury made her seem small. After a recent engagement where 700 or 800 dark wizards went in and barely over 100 returned, Voldemort summoned everyone. He would personally act. The call pulled in forces from Germany and surrounding regions, leaving gaping holes elsewhere. Within hours, almost every Death Eater who could be spared gathered, over 400 wizards and more than 1,000 monsters, though only a couple of hundred were above level 10, and 30 or 40 above level 14. With Voldemort leading, the plan was to crush Hogwarts in one sweep. So, on December 24, Christmas Eve, the Dark Lord marched north with his army and entered a battered Hogsmeade. Voldemort issued an ultimatum. Hogwarts must hand over Bones and Epiphany and others, accept his clemency and become his servants, or the wizarding world would suffer devastation and a generational gap. Bellatrix mouthed the message, her voice echoing like rolling thunder around the school before dinner. She praised Voldemort and derided the Ministry, and panic rippled through Hogwarts. Tents filled the Black Lake's banks and the Quidditch pitch as everyone prepared for the next day. Some thought the fall of Hogsmeade had gone well, the enemy had taken losses. But confronting Voldemort in full force was another matter. Ted's image had shifted in people's minds after his lightning display. Even senior Ministry officials were deferential now. And yet the real terror remained. You know who. Panic dropped morale by 20%. Some hidden Death Eaters at Hogwarts saw an opportunity. If Voldemort only wanted Ted and Minister Bones, perhaps they could save themselves. Why not betray a few and live? That reckless talk could not go unpunished. An hour later, an Auror team led by Mad-Eye Moody began arresting suspected collaborators. Scrimgeour had fallen at Hogsmeade. Moody, stern and indomitable, was the only Auror with the command and prestige to act. At dawn the next day, Voldemort emerged from his temporary laboratory, barefoot, skin as pale as if he'd been dead 3 days, wearing a black robe that hung as if nothing else lay beneath. It seems they will not accept my goodwill, he said. A Death Eater informed him they had captured some of their buried agents. Bellatrix raised the silver hand Voldemort had crafted for her. Master, let me lead the assault. I will break into Hogwarts and bring them to you, she demanded. Voldemort glanced at her, unimpressed. Then a Death Eater burst in with bad news. Master, Gringotts is under attack. Gringotts under attack. In the confusion after the Ministry's fall, many Death Eaters had tried to pry open vaults. Gringotts had always been resilient. The goblins' vaults, the deposits of centuries of wizards, were vast. After foreign fairies moved in to keep things running, the bank had resumed operations. The fairies had been dabbling in speculative ventures, trying to make quick gains now that other currencies were crashing and gold alone held value. But something had gone very wrong. A Swiss fairy brought news of an interdimensional incursion, a point of entry that had existed unnoticed for some time. The fairies, greedy and desperate, had taken a gamble. They woke a dragon, not a normal dragon of this world, but a beast from another world. 40 meters long, sleeping in a hoard beneath Gringotts, and now awakened and furious. It tore through vaults, occupied the subterranean vault network, took the gold, and would not leave. The fairies who summoned it were horrified at its size. The dragon beneath Gringotts was not a Gringotts creature at all. It was Smog. Neville and Nagini kept walking through the whiteness, but far beneath the surface of time and place, the wizarding world was breaking into new, unimaginable chaos. Thanks to reader Yu Qingyuan for the 100-point reward. 477. Sacrifice Balrog Smog the Dragon, the last great dragon from Middle-earth, the one who once laid waste to the dwarf kingdom of Erebor and hoarded an unimaginable treasure, had appeared in this world more than 2 years earlier because of an interdimensional breach. At the time, the intrusion had been so gentle that it didn't rouse Smog from his sleep. He slumbered, surrounded by gold and then by rubble. Later, when the goblins who now ran Gringotts got their hands on the place, their greed was boundless. Frightened of poverty and unwilling to spend a single galleon, they took every scrap they could. They feared discovery, feared Voldemort's wrath, and the killing curse, and so they cooked up a plan to balance the books. Lure a dragon into Gringotts. A dragon had once struck that bank before. Another would explain any losses. They sent someone to bait Smog, and to their astonishment, it worked. They hadn't expected the scale of the disaster. More than 100 goblins were killed, and Smog overturned and occupied Gringotts, taking residence among the vaults and refusing to leave. Voldemort was in Hogsmeade, preparing to crush the last pockets of resistance, when news arrived from his rear. His face went stone cold. No one dared interrupt him. After a long beat, he said, "Don't worry about those goblins. Take Hogwarts first. When I come back to London, I'll make them pay. They worship gold? Fine. Let them sleep with it forever." Voldemort had hidden for years, but had not lost his strategic steadiness. Smog's unexpected theft would not change his priorities. That boy, Epiphany, could not be allowed to live and grow. Every spark of opposition had to be snuffed immediately. Gringotts' missing gold was a small price to pay. He gathered his forces. Dementors, giants, vampires, ogres, trolls, every monstrous ally he could find, and prepared a decisive assault on Hogwarts. From a high ridge he smiled, bloodless and expectant, his eyes fixed on the castle that had once been his school. A great battle was about to begin. At the same time, far away in Africa, Grindelwald was dealing with another breach. An intrusion had opened in a mountain range and revealed a vast underground complex, the Mines of Moria. It teemed with half-orcs, goblins, and trolls by the tens of thousands. Grindelwald had swept through and sealed the place because deep within the mines he had detected a terrible, malevolent, magical fluctuation, a signal of something monstrous. Now, as Voldemort massed his forces in Britain, Grindelwald and Ted stood before the thing that had caused the alarm. "Is this the Balrog you mentioned?" Grindelwald asked. "That's it," Ted said. "Do we need it for Albus? He must be slain. The balance between the living and the dead demands it. If something comes out from that other world, something must be sent back from here. Then let's not waste time. Don't delay the fight at Hogwarts." Even among the creatures that had crossed over, the Balrog was no minor foe. Along with Smog, it was one of the most powerful single beings to have stepped through an interdimensional breach so far. Ted and Grindelwald, one a master of the magic network that sprawled like a web across half the globe, the other a wizard with command of tremendous forces, subdued it in 7 or 8 minutes. Ted sealed the creature in a massive block of ice. "What do we do with it?" Grindelwald asked. "Sacrifice it," Ted replied. Then Albus can be resurrected? We'll see what the situation is, Ted answered. They had done what they could on their end, but whether that would be enough to bring Dumbledore back depended on what was happening at Hogwarts and beyond. Without being there in person or extending the network to that battlefield, Death's boundary could not be treated lightly. Hogwarts' defenses were no accident. Although the sprawling grounds and newly built sections looked inviting, the castle itself was built on defensible, treacherous terrain. A deep chasm and sheer cliffs in front, connected only by a long covered bridge, the vast Black Lake on one side and the forbidden forest on the other, and the castle perched on an artificial hill. For a large army, there was essentially only one approach, a frontal assault across that bridge. The school's protections were enhanced and layered. Hundreds of stone statues and carvings around the castle could be animated. The ground itself had been prepared to produce powerful clay golems whose lower bodies melded into the earth, granting them remarkable regenerative ability. Those clay constructs were not primitive. They combined rhenology, magic theory, array magic, and alchemy. Alongside the statuary's ancient enchantments, they made a lethal complementary defense. Voldemort, too proud to lead the charge in person, stood in reserve. With a casual wave, he caused the bloody sigils on the foreheads of his monstrous allies to bulge outward, as if trying to burst through the flesh. The giants, vampires, ogres, trolls, their minds flooded with agony and compulsion from the marks, howled and surged forward in a mad stampede toward the castle. Coordination was non-existent. The marks kept them obedient. The first giant stepped onto the bridge and was met by a sudden eruption of stone spikes, each as thick as a thigh and half a meter long. They impaled his foot. He screamed, but the pain in his brow where the mark burned hurt worse. His face twisted almost with relief. He tore his pierced foot free and thundered forward, barefoot and bleeding, urging his fellows on. Behind the lead giant came 2 or 3 more giants, a couple of trolls and ogres, and a mass of lesser monsters. The castle answered with everything it had. A rune on the protective shield coalesced, and an onslaught of ice, blocks, blades, arrows, spikes, struck the bridge. Dozens of hits would have felled an ordinary opponent, but giants are not ordinary. Shards ripped flesh and armor, frozen blood crusted their hides. Under the cruel pain of the prowling rune and the mark on their heads, however, the cold seemed to ease the frontal torment. The lead giant roared for more, braving the blizzard of ice. The others followed, plowing on. When the chieftain reached the far end of the bridge, he raised his club and smashed down. A 3-meter-high clay golem, the product of several smaller golems fused by magic, bore the full force. The impact tore half-orc flesh and mud into the air and splattered it dozens of meters away, but other half-orcs surged and clung to the giant's legs, turning into viscous mud and gluing his lower limbs to the ground. Animated statues leapt like birds, thrusting spears toward the giant's face. The chieftain batted 2 aside, but a slender stone figure drove its spear into one of the giant's eyes. The creature howled as blood and strange ichor spurted. Then a bright magnifying lens of magic appeared on the shield. A laser-hot beam shot out and punched a fist-sized hole through another giant's chest. A wound like that might not cripple a giant unless it seared the heart, but this one was scorching force. The giant collapsed, crashed through the railings, and plunged headfirst into the crevice below. Even a giant could not survive one such concentrated strike. From Voldemort's vantage high on the ridge, he and his commanders watched the shield unfold its repertoire. Spikes and ice, fusion golems and animated statues, precision beams that could incinerate colossal foes. For all his confidence, Voldemort stood silent for a long, unnerving moment. These British wizards, mediocre as he had always dismissed them, had built something extraordinary. The defensive system before them was not merely Hogwarts' old charms. It was the culmination of many traditions: the mystical Lock of Elves, dwarven runecraft, gnomish magical engineering, the Type Moon workshop, and barrier techniques Ted had shared, improved runes and hex cores from the Valoran continent, all refined by massive collaborative effort and integrated into Hogwarts' existing protections and the magic network hub beneath the school. It was truly a war magic system, powerful, flexible, and beyond what any single wizard might manage. But it had a weakness. The array's power and the magic it could output at any given point were finite. If an unimaginably powerful strike could focus on a single point and exhaust that node, it might breach the shield. Finding or provoking that point was the trick, and Voldemort was testing. He was throwing cannon fodder against the defenses to probe for a core or an exhaustible seam. 10 minutes in, most of the fast, heavy frontline monsters had been cut down. The battlefield stank of blood and made a carpet of corpses that might as well be siege works. Hogwarts' losses were far smaller in proportion. A few dozen stone figures shattered, several clay golems tossed about, but the school's magic allowed continuous regeneration so long as the small, rune-like cores remained intact. Confidence inside the castle swelled. The blue hemispherical shield rippled with each strike like a bowl braced against a storm, runes tracing circuits along its inner surface and producing ice, fire, blizzard, and myriad buffs and debuffs, a fortress crafted out of layered enchantments. To the students and defenders inside, it felt like a miracle. This was Hogwarts, and they would not let it fall. While the battle raged in Britain, Ted and Grindelwald had finished with the Balrog. The creature, a humanoid of shadow and flame crowned with curved horns, wielded a fiery whip and sword and left burning footprints in rock. But against Ted's network mastery and Grindelwald's might, it was subdued rapidly. Frozen in a block of ice, the Balrog lay immobilized. "If we use it as a sacrifice," Grindelwald asked again, "can Albus be brought back?" "We'll have to see how things go over there," Ted said. They had done what they could, but resurrecting someone from the boundary between life and death was uncertain without direct influence over the battlefield or unfettered access to the network in that place. Back at the edge of life and death, Neville ran. Guided by Nagini, he kept moving through an endless whiteness until the landscape slowly coalesced into familiarity. Hardened roads gave way to concrete, man-made details appearing like a sketch being filled in. Then, suddenly, he knew where he was. A train station. Bright, overexposed light washed everything, but the shapes were right. King's Cross, platform 9 3/4, the long-ago portal to Hogwarts. "Neville, you did it! You found the way," Nagini said. "The way?" Neville panted. He had been running for so long he barely knew who he was. Then a tall figure approached. White hair, white beard, white robes, that unmistakable, kindly-lined face. "Dumbledore?" Neville cried. "Oh, Neville, you've come. I've been waiting," Dumbledore said with a smile. "You're not dead?" Neville blurted, the joy almost overwhelming. "To be precise," Dumbledore said gently, "both you and I are not alive in the way we used to be. We have not completely passed on." He pointed toward the rails beneath the platform. "If we go that way, we go forward into another world and begin another journey. If we choose to go back, we'll be resurrected," Neville finished, desperate. "That is one possibility," Dumbledore conceded. "Usually souls who arrive here can go forward or linger and become ghosts, but we have another choice." A soft cough cut across the whiteness. Nagini stiffened. "Someone else?" she hissed. Neville followed the sound to a long wooden bench. In the gaps of the slatted wood, a small, reddish object peered out, grotesque against the pure white. Up close, it was horrific. Neville stepped back. Dumbledore's face grew solemn. He looked down at the thing beneath the bench. "This is poor Tom," he said quietly. "He tore his soul into pieces. This is one of them." 478. Extreme joy brings sorrow. Lord Voldemort? Could it be that he's the one inside my forehead? Neville stared in disbelief. He had imagined the fragment of Voldemort in his mind as powerful and malevolent, not ugly and weak, like a malformed infant. After all, that piece of soul had not been intentionally severed. It had been ripped away by the rebound of his own killing curse. Malnourished seemed an apt description. Dumbledore regarded the dying fragment with a peculiar mixture of relief and melancholy, as if a long journey were finally ending or a rambling novel had reached its final page. He asked quietly, "Who did this? Who did it to you?" Neville was quick to piece things together. "It was Bellatrix. Ted said you couldn't just pick anyone to do something like this. Not just anyone could. In the end, Bellatrix was chosen." "Bellatrix?" Dumbledore frowned. "I thought Tom would do it himself. Only if he did it himself would it have that effect." He nodded toward the deformed scrap of soul beneath the chair, which had started to curl and twitch. "Ted said Bellatrix's silver hand was made by Lord Voldemort himself. That silver hand can He paused, the implication clear to him, though not to Neville. A look of dawning comprehension crossed Dumbledore's face. Ah, so that's how it is. Tom still trusts her too much. The fragment gave a final faint sigh, went utterly still, and began to crumble to dust. At that very moment, a distant rumbling came from the railway. An old steam locomotive, painted in Hogwarts Express red with flame livery, eased into the station. Dumbledore blinked in surprise. It seems our friends have lent us significant aid. That will make things much more convenient. At Hogwarts, the battle had been raging for nearly an hour. The Death Eaters had thrown everything at them. Siege trolls and giants, insectoid monsters like enormous mantises, hordes of goblins, merfolk, jackalweirs, and other cannon fodder. But the front line of stone and mud golems held stubbornly. Repeated assaults failed to break through. Ted's defensive array struck with terrible regularity, one large-scale magical attack every minute or two. Even the 6-meter siege trolls, clad in iron, were frozen into icy sculptures, blocking the covered bridge. The giants fell in turn. The insect monsters were smashed into pieces, leaving sticky green ichor everywhere. A single area spell could fell dozens of goblins or lesser dark creatures. The Death Eaters also deployed an air force, dementors among them, huge foul-smelling birds like vultures over 3 meters long, ape-like beasts with bat wings, even vampires cloaked in black. But every flying assailant that neared the hemispherical shield was shot down by scattered rockets, ice arrows, and lightning spells. 40 or 50 vampires trying to approach from another direction were turned to ash by flash explosions. Even vampires within their own ranks felt a chill upon seeing such defenses. Inside the shield, morale soared. The students and defenders had a real chance at victory. Years of oppression and fear dissolved in a flood of hope. "We're coming back," they cried. This was the dawn of a new era of magic, far beyond the old backward systems. "We won! We won!" "Not yet," one voice reminded them. "We're about to win," another answered. "It's Christmas," someone else shouted. In the heat of the battle, everyone had forgotten the day. "Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas," people called, clasping hands and laughing. Hermione's roommate, a gnome named Clara, squealed, "Merry Christmas, Hermione. This is the best present ever." Hermione only nodded. She was less certain. Ted's defensive array had been designed to be powerful, but she didn't believe it invulnerable to Lord Voldemort. That thought weighed on her. On the Death Eaters' side, despair had settled in. A group of them watched from a hillside as nearly 1,000 of their monsters were annihilated. The Great Shield had turned their invincible legions into corpses and rubble. Some lesser Death Eaters, careless and too close, were slain by the area effects of their own side's magic, destroyed like insignificant ants. The Dark Lord himself watched, motionless and silent, and unease began to spread. Was he failing? Could the invincible Lord Voldemort be thwarted? Yet things are not so simple. If anyone looked closely at the hairless, corpse-pale Dark Lord, they would have noticed a change. One pupil had shrunk to a pinpoint of red. It was the result of Voldemort's obsession, studying death itself. To master death, even a little, had always been his aim. With his extraordinary talent for the dark arts and knowledge gleaned from other worlds, he had made more progress than anyone imagined. He was the master of killing curses. He had begun to grasp some of death's rules. Watching the defensive array cycle and repeat, drawing on life to defend Hogwarts, Voldemort had learned its principles. He now saw a weakness. With a single resonant Avada Kedavra, he struck. The incantation rolled like thunder. A green bolt, at an impossible angle, pierced the array and vanished. The hemispherical shield began to flicker, and before anyone could react, popped like a soap bubble. The protective dome shattered, and Hogwarts Castle stood exposed. Voldemort laughed, first soft, then a high, terrible cascade of mirth that echoed across the field. The thrill of killing a powerful opponent seized him. Each unraveled secret of death excited him. The deaths suffered by his monsters and a few dozen wizards were nothing, useful sacrifices. The battlefield fell into a stunned silence, broken only by his unhinged laughter. Then he moved. He unfurled his robes and dissolved into a wisp of black smoke that shot across the sky. Death Eaters followed in a swirl, landing at the far end of the covered bridge. Voldemort pointed his serpent-headed wand, and the enchanted stone statues that guarded the bridge grew mottled and yellow. Cracks spidered across them until they shattered. The towering mud golems bubbled and rotted, stinking as they collapsed into fetid puddles. Voldemort walked across the bridge with a languid, predatory ease, Death Eaters trailing like a pride. He studied the castle and its surroundings with the detached curiosity of a man revisiting old haunts. The Black Lake was calm. The rockery in its tower stirred memories of his school days. The renovated Quidditch pitch now looked like a refugee camp. Everything was familiar, and that familiarity made him smile. He was over 70 by now. His best years were behind him. Fortunately, he had time. Professor McGonagall and Minister Bones stood with the defenders, their faces set. Seeing Voldemort approaching barefoot, a throng of Death Eaters at his back, hope turned to a heavy silence. This was an unconquerable enemy, a walking agent of death. Voldemort's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and snake-like. Where is Epiphany?" he asked with a smile that showed far too many white teeth. The question stirred a murmur through the crowd, but no one answered. Voldemort's smile faded. "I said, deliver Epiphany and his companions, and I will spare the others. That offer still stands." He added, with a grim touch of mockery, "Oh, it's Christmas, isn't it?" His sardonic humor made his smile even more chilling. "Tell him to come out quick. He wouldn't abandon you, would he?" "He's not running away," Ron cried suddenly. "You know where he is?" Voldemort asked coldly. "Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Now leave," Ron said, voice steady. He pushed past an adult and stepped into the front, the Weasley family forming up behind him. Parents, brothers, siblings, all choosing to stand together in the face of death. "Crucio," Voldemort snapped. The curse shot toward Ron. The Weasleys pooled their shield charms, but the double shield tore like tissue. Yet the curse struck a honeycomb blue layer of magic, an arm guard-like protection on Ron's arm, that exploded outward and neutralized the curse. The trinket had done its job, sacrificing itself to save him. "An interesting bauble," Voldemort mused with scorn. He flicked his wand, ready to press the advantage, when Hermione suddenly shouted, "I know where Ted went!" "Hermione!" someone hissed, trying to stop her. Voldemort turned his cold gaze on her. "Girl, speak." She gripped her wand. "He left last night to do something that can defeat you." Voldemort sneered. Wishful thinking. He raised his wand, but McGonagall and Flitwick moved instantly to protect Hermione. "Lord Voldemort," McGonagall cried, "you will not harm my students." Voldemort's face tightened. He had expected submission and terror. He had not expected such courage. "You were afraid of Dumbledore," McGonagall said flatly, and the name struck like a blow. "Damn it," Voldemort hissed. "I fear no one, not the old fool Dumbledore, nor that boy." Bellatrix leaned forward and whispered in his ear, "Master, we still have an undercover agent among them." Voldemort's eyes lit up. He loved the sight of betrayal and broken hearts. "Of course," he said. "Among you are my people, Malfoy and Lothar." A hush fell. Eyes flicked toward Draco Malfoy and Andre Lothar in the crowd. Both were Slytherins, both outstanding. Draco had been close to the group in recent years. Could they be traitors? Bellatrix smiled a sharp, venomous smile. "Draco," she purred. "Lothar." She relished the moment. Then several more figures stepped out from the mob and knelt before Voldemort, calling him master. These were his planted agents, people he trusted in the British magical world. "Rise," Voldemort said flatly. "You will be rewarded." But one of those planted agents spoke up. "Dark Lord, you have done nothing but evil. You will not have a good end." Gasps spread. That voice belonged to Draco. People turned, stunned. Draco looked to Harry, who stood firmly at his side, gripping his hand. Draco's declaration of defiance surprised everyone. Lothar, too, nodded. "I could not soil my family's name by following you," he said. At that moment, a previously unremarkable man walked forward and patted Draco on the shoulder. He dropped his disguise. Voldemort's eyes widened, and Bellatrix uttered a shriek. "Lucius, you're not dead?" she cried. Lucius Malfoy, who had faked his death, stood before the Dark Lord. "I could not die before I saw the Dark Lord fall," he said. Rage flooded Voldemort. He felt exposed, humiliated in front of everyone. He wanted blood. "Avada," he began, and with a single harsh word, a thick green jet shot from his wand. It split into 5 or 6 forked lightning-like tendrils and hurtled toward the crowd. A shimmering blue barrier rose and intercepted the blast. Voldemort's chained Avada Kedavra splintered and dissipated. He glanced upward, and then, descending slowly from the sky, came Ted. Ted's form grew clearer. He floated down, composed and unhurried, and spoke in a voice that carried across the battlefield. "I heard you've been looking for me," he said. "Hold on, brothers. It's almost over. 479. Can you recognize this formation? Lord Voldemort, I heard you've been looking for me." Ted drifted down from the sky and landed before the crowd, 10 meters from Lord Voldemort. It had been him who, moments ago, had tapped into the underground magic network to dissipate Voldemort's mass-killing curse. The Dark Lord's strange eyes, able to see the death points of people and objects, had been acquired less than 2 months ago, and Hogwarts' magical defenses were anchored on that very network hub. Ted had only managed to crash the shield temporarily. It could be reactivated in 30 or 40 minutes. Of course, with Voldemort's power, he didn't need 30 or 40 minutes. He could slaughter everyone present many times over in 3. Ted Epiphany, Voldemort stared at the young man, tall, handsome, and unnervingly confident, smiling in his presence. The audacity. He remembered this boy from years ago, from when Voldemort had been a human-faced tumor in the Albanian forest for 10 years before returning to the world by possessing Quirrell. Back then, he had sought the Philosopher's Stone to restore himself and had been outplayed by Dumbledore. That whole affair had been riddled with coincidences. Perhaps the exposure of the stone's whereabouts had been bait. The old man had always been a step ahead. And that boy, along with Longbottom, had been a constant nuisance. Now the same boy dared to stand before him and act so relaxed. "Young people don't know their place," Voldemort snapped, offended by the boy's nonchalant expression. "You stand before the Dark Lord and you're not even trembling? Do I mean so little to you?" Ted noticed the violence flashing in Voldemort's face and held up a hand. "Don't rush to act. Opportunities like this are rare. Let's talk a bit. It's not the first time I've seen you." Voldemort's impatience flared. "There's nothing to talk about. Today you will die. But if you take your own life, I'll spare your friends. Will you sacrifice yourself for them?" The old man's appetite for theatrics and cruelty made Ted's skin crawl. "Ted, don't listen to him. Fight him," Ron shouted. The belt at his waist began to glow. "Exactly. Trust your wands, not him," Jerry yelled. Hermione, "Fight! Harry, fight to the end!" Shouts rose, and some remained silent, unsure. Wizards and Death Eaters bristled across the space between Ted and Voldemort. Then Ted snapped his fingers. Instantly, all sound vanished. The crowd's yelling was swallowed. "Everyone, don't be so anxious. Let's chat. This may be our only chance," he said, smiling. Voldemort's face turned sharp. He fixed his gaze on Ted, trying to glean something. The earlier mass-killing curse had been cast in fury without thought. For someone to counter it so neatly was one thing. But this silent finger snap, no wand work, no detectable magical fluctuations, and yet sound itself gone from the surrounding space, left him puzzled. Voldemort could silence a region with wandless, nonverbal magic. The principle here, however, was entirely different. He could see no trace of how the boy had done it. "You've taken that step?" he asked, more suspicious than surprised. Ted grinned. "That's right. I'm already a legend." Voldemort's expression went through a series of contortions, bitterness, disbelief, then a cold, empty fury. He had broken the boundaries of this world himself with the aid of an otherworldly magic system in his 70s. Dumbledore and Grindelwald had been elderly, legendary figures. How could a 17-year-old reach a comparable level? It felt like everything he'd suffered, death, resurrection, soul-tearing, being toyed with by that otherworldly force, had been for nothing. How dare this boy make it look effortless? Most of those present, of course, did not understand the weight of the word legend. The concept circulated in the upper circles of the wizarding world, a handful of people here. Professor McGonagall, Professor Olivier, Minister Bones knew what it meant. Only 30 or 40 among the 700 or 800 present really understood. McGonagall looked at the boy in front of her in stunned disbelief. She could still picture him buying a second-hand robe in Diagon Alley. Now the boy she'd guided into the magic world called himself a legend? She felt time's speed like an old guitar string being plucked. A murmur ran through the crowd as people whispered and tried to explain the term. Frustrated, a father leaned over to hiss at his son, "Stop asking. Being a legend means Ted has reached Dumbledore's level." The words hung in the air. Several heads turned. It seemed outrageous, but no one could say for sure there was a hierarchy among legends. Voldemort, however, didn't need this debate. He glared at Ted. I never thought he would leave me such a surprise. So you have the confidence to stand before me. What did Dumbledore do? He was convinced Dumbledore must have set some trap, something left behind to allow Ted to become a legend and oppose him. If the old man had prepared for this moment, if Grindelwald was involved, Voldemort felt a strange fury and a prickling dread. He snapped, "Tell me, where is that old man hiding?" Ted blinked. Voldemort had guessed Dumbledore? Not bad, old Voldy. Speak, where is Grindelwald hiding? Don't be so secretive and make people look down on you. Voldemort demanded, his tone fierce but with a wobble of desperation. Two legends, one old, one young, teamed up, and maybe he wouldn't be able to win. What would that do to his reputation? What would the Death Eaters think? At that moment, in the hidden room of Requirement Base, Neville's eyelashes fluttered. He drew a sharp breath and sat bolt upright. Ansu, flapping frantic wings, dropped the potato chips he'd been stuffing in his beak. Holy moly, you scared me. Neville, are you alive? Ansu, the secret base? What's happening out there? Neville didn't have time to marvel at being alive. He focused immediately on the fight. A faint blue light danced in Ansu's eyes, and then he shook his head. Not yet. The battle hasn't started. Let's go help. Neville leapt from bed, shoved his feet into shoes, and ran. Hey, wait! Your wand! Bring your wand! Put some clothes on! Ansu yelled, stuffing a whole bag of chips into his mouth. Muggle food is the best. Back at the rockery, Voldemort's suspicion didn't have much time to linger. A white light blinked into being above the assembled wizards. It wasn't dazzling so much as quiet and absolute. A robed figure formed in it, beard and hair white as snow. Dumbledore. Dumbledore! He's back! The crowd's relief rose like a wave. With Dumbledore here, fear of Voldemort ebbed. How is that possible? You were dead! Voldemort lunged at the apparition, his voice a raw shout. Dumbledore descended slowly. The white glow faded into the robes of a familiar, composed figure. Yes, Tom, I died. But I have returned, he said, his voice steady and reassuring. The Death Eaters' faces fell. In the space of an hour, they had been rocked by reversals. Voldemort, who had the deepest understanding of the rules of death, was the most shocked. He had been the one to resurrect others before, in a nightmarish, pseudo-living way, using the ancestral resurrection stone and manipulations through the ferryman of the Styx. Those he resurrected existed in pain and emptiness. Dumbledore's return did not match any of that. You conquered death? Voldemort demanded. Dumbledore shook his head. No, I have not conquered death, and I cannot truly be made alive again. I am not truly living. I have placed myself within change. Only change is eternal. Old man, speak plainly, Voldemort snarled. The crowd behind Ted stirred again. Neville? Neville, you're all right? You're not. Ginny's voice cut through. Neville, she flung herself at him. Neville, nearly 1.86 meters even barefoot, nearly stumbled as she clung to him. Ginny, I'm fine. Don't be afraid. I still have to fight, he protested, but she wept openly now, tears she had kept since his body was returned the night before. Bellatrix, Bella, could not bear it. Neville Longbottom? Impossible, she cried. She had been the one to cast the killing curse on the golden boy. There had to be a mistake. But with Dumbledore resurrected, Neville's return was no longer unimaginable. Voldemort's mind reeled. Had this all been a trap laid for him? Then Grindelwald stepped out from the crowd, silent, and he and Dumbledore exchanged a nod. Voldemort's laugh, strange and manic, burst out. Pfft! Ha-ha! He ignored the eyes upon him and laughed loud enough to be chilling. Dumbledore, you've set a splendid stage for today. Dumbledore nodded back, and Voldemort roared, You can't kill me. I, Lord Voldemort, am immortal and indestructible. He jabbed his snake-headed wand at Dumbledore. You may wipe out those behind me, but you will not kill me. I will return soon. When I do, I want all of you. His wand drew a slow, cruel arc, to die. The crowd fell silent. Voldemort had means of resurrection more terrible and intricate than Horcruxes. His soul was protected in ways that made him, in his own eyes, unkillable. He might not be able to topple another legend, but he could slaughter everyone else. That was why Dumbledore had always held back. Not many noticed the next figure at first. Then one person moved forward, hair long, robes black, footsteps silent as storm clouds. Severus Snape. Lord Voldemort, it's time for you to pay. His voice was flat as always. Ted smiled and waved a hand. Suddenly, countless pillars of light ignited across Hogwarts as a massive magical array unfolded, cloaking the school. The rockery and tall tower Voldemort had been standing on were part of a hub for this very array. Neville, Harry, Hermione, and Ron each clutched an item that glowed: the Gryffindor sword, Slytherin's locket, Ravenclaw's diadem, Hufflepuff's golden cup. The four founders' relics, and Dumbledore, Grindelwald, Snape, and Ted made 8 nodes encircling the rockery and tower, forming a complex, sprawling formation. A cold pressure settled over Voldemort. For an instant he felt dizzy, outrage and the urge to kill bubbling up. He locked eyes with Snape. "Snape, you've become a legend too?" Snape's face was unreadable. "All thanks to you. Today it will all be returned." Ted cracked his neck and smiled, feeling the tension drain. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," he said. "Lord Voldemort, do you recognize this array?" 480. Lord Newton appears unexpectedly. I had waited too long for this moment. The preparations began 2 years ago, and everything had been planned for this exact instant, to trap Lord Voldemort here and finish him once and for all. It wasn't that Voldemort couldn't be killed, others had done it before, but that he couldn't be kept dead. He had once used Horcruxes, which were at least somewhat traceable. Later, however, he severed himself from the local dark arts system and built his own legendary magic. He had found a way to isolate himself from death. Even if his body were destroyed, his soul could reconstitute elsewhere in a prearranged refuge. It was far more cunning than Horcruxes, and the only resurrection preparation Ted and the others had ever been able to identify was Bella. When Ted destroyed the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been lodged in Neville's body through Bella, he confirmed that she must be one of Voldemort's contingencies. There could be dozens, even scores more. Killing Voldemort once was comparatively simple. Several people here could manage it. Stopping him from coming back was almost impossible in a world so vast. That was why everyone had thrown themselves into this plan. The Founder's relics, the 4 young allies fated to oppose him, and the grand formation built by Ted and the other 3 legendary wizards, it was all intended to make this a single decisive strike. In this place, Voldemort's soul would have nowhere to flee. When the formation completed, it looked like something out of myth. A demon-slaying array unfolded across the grounds. The Gryffindor sword, the Hufflepuff golden cup, the Ravenclaw diadem, and the Slytherin locket had become the 4 immortal slaying weapons. Hogwarts itself and the magic web were the formation diagrams. Ted and the other 4 were the 4 sages. For the formation to slay Voldemort, all 4 sages had to be present. As the array spread, it seemed to rewrite magic and matter. Everything returned to fundamentals, as if pulled back toward chaos. Space stretched. What had been hand's reach now looked like dozens of meters away. Floating above people's heads were health bars, mana bars, buff icons, and debuff icons, like a wizarding version of a game HUD. Most wizards gaped. "Is this the magic world?" someone whispered. This was an advanced application of Ted's mindscape descent, his consciousness wrapping reality. Allied wizards found various buffs hovering over them. Some even gained top-tier equipment, followers, and pets from the magic world. The Death Eaters, who mostly disliked playing the game and had little time for it amid their Eastern European campaigns, dared not imitate this. Instead, they were hit with a stack of crippling debuffs: reduced attributes, lower accuracy, slowed mana regeneration, spell failure, increased vulnerability, and odd maladies, enough to unnerve anyone. Others among them, old-timers who had never heard of the magic world, only saw that the enemy's numbers had swollen from 700 or 800 to over 1,000, while they still had only 400 or 500. It looked hopeless. Inside the inner layer of the formation, Ted and the others were physically separated from the ordinary wizards. They could see the outer battle, but a thin wall of energy kept them apart. Lord Voldemort felt it like a cold hand down his spine. His sixth sense screamed danger. His skin prickled with icy needles, and a sense of doom pressed at his chest. He knew this was no ordinary trick. The rule the kid had mastered. Could it really be the rule of formations? Worse, the 4 across from him were legends. Voldemort could handle one of them alone. 4 made the situation unbearable. He had prepared for this possibility. Over a dozen hidden soul stones spread across Europe, a few even in America and under the Arctic ice. Kill me? Not a chance. At worst, he would die again. He had contingency after contingency. He smiled with all his teeth and flicked his robes. 4 skulls shot from his sleeves and hung in the air, each dripping with a miasma of emerald magic as he built skeletal bodies around them. Over the past year, he had been grave robbing on an industrial scale. Famous wizards from across the world reanimated as living dead. But those were primitive experiments. These 4 skulls were the product of real research, carefully chosen, powerful souls. The first to take shape was a tall skeleton in a tattered gold-embroidered robe, a strange crown on its head. In one hand, it held a massive iron-bound tome, in the other, a short iron hammer. In life, he had been Kramer, the inquisitor who wrote the treatise the Muggles called the Witch's Hammer. A squib consumed with envy and hatred for wizards, Voldemort had gathered his bones, summoned his spirit, and turned him into a level 10 demon cultivator and level 10 undead inquisitor. A dangerous elite. The Witch's Hammer and the Witchcraft Code in his hands glowed as red-quality artifacts. The second formed into a stout, shriveled zombie in armor, a sharp sword at his waist, and a strangely blue face. Gilles de Rais, a French marshal, once Joan of Arc's comrade in arms, later a murderer and practitioner of dark alchemy, had been resurrected from ashes smuggled to Voldemort. In life, he had become a real-world inspiration for Bluebeard. The third was hunched and thin, like a ghoul, but wore a tall Ravenclaw's diadem and held a scepter with the bearing of someone important. John the Swelfth, an ancient pope notorious for depravity and murder, was back, a relic of 1,000 years ago. Ted, watching through the magic web, had already read their files and was appalled. Where had Voldemort found such scoundrels? And the fourth skull, younger by comparison, from only a couple of centuries back, shocked him most. Dressed in tattered Victorian clothes, chestnut curls framing a narrow face, the figure looked like a dry, shrunken mummy. "Sir Isaac Newton?" Ted blurted. He had known Death Eaters had opened Newton's coffin, but never imagined Voldemort would bring Newton himself into this. Newton's dry eyes rolled. He glanced at the other 3 and at Voldemort, then with a decrepit gesture pressed his own hand to his face. His body dissolved into dust and vanished within seconds. He'd self-destructed. Ted stared, stunned. Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Snape all looked at Voldemort with disgust. "What is this?" Dumbledore asked. "Is that all you have to show us?" Voldemort's face went red with fury. Newton had been one of his prized acquisitions. He'd hoped to craft the legendary level undead from him. Newton wasn't a wizard, but he dabbled with wizards and excelled at alchemy. He'd actually comprehended a rule, the rule of gravity. Voldemort had hoped to harness that, for Newton to humiliate him and destroy himself on purpose. Infuriating. "Humph, 3 will do," Voldemort sneered and flicked his sleeve again. Countless pale ghosts surged out in a torrent, several hundred, perhaps 1,000 vengeful spirits, and he launched himself forward, attacking before Ted and the others could react. The 3 undead lunged at their assigned opponents, and Voldemort shot a spell at Dumbledore. Outside the formation, the battle had already begun in earnest. The Death Eaters were fighting at a numerical disadvantage and now faced the ebb and flow of the array's power. Those among the defenders who had gained equipment, followers, and pets from the game were suddenly terrifying. A spellbreaker follower, designed to counter spellcasters, strode into the fray with level 6 magic resistance and equipment tailored to stop casters, cleaving several unlucky Death Eaters in half. A berserker orc follower, roaring with blood-red light, charged and carved a whirlwind through their ranks. Psychic pets, illusion beasts, the magical auxiliaries made a huge difference. Most Hogwarts students were held in reserve, but it hardly mattered. In 5 or 6 minutes, the Death Eaters suffered 40 to 50 casualties, almost a tenth of their forces. Inside the array, Hermione had connected herself to the demon-slaying array and began weaving large-scale spells using its power. Wearing the Ravenclaw diadem, her intellect was amplified. Harry, with the locket against his chest, found his hand seals twisted with dark arts variances, and one palm strike carried layered negative effects. Neville's swing of the Gryffindor sword cut through multiple protections at once: shield charms, protego totalum, deflection charms, as if they were mere cloth. Ron, clutching the Hufflepuff cup, looked bewildered. The cup radiated green restorative light. It could restore stamina and mana, heal wounds, and mitigate magical afflictions. "Why am I holding Hufflepuff's cup?" Ron muttered. The Hufflepuffs bristled. "Our house isn't devoid of people." Jerry, Ron's friend, grinned. "Maybe they picked you because you're the only one who eats enough to use it." Ron shrugged and accepted the consolation. "Thanks, mate." Back in the inner lair, Voldemort relied on the 1,000 vengeful spirits to pin Dumbledore down for 3 or 4 minutes. Dumbledore, not an explosive duelist, but the most stable wizard present, turned into a being of white light. A distorted, shifting domain manifested around him. It felt like the demon body talent Ted had once encountered, except the demon body was a body turning into raw magic, whereas Dumbledore seemed to transmute into rules themselves. When the spirits struck, they were captured, changed, and then the blood and severed limbs melted away until the ghosts resembled their living forms and dissipated. He was purifying them. Ted and the others had already dealt with their opponents. The Witch Hunter, the first undead, was only a level 20 elite. Grindelwald, not going all out, dispatched him in under a minute while studying him. Bluebeard dissolved into a potion brewed by Snape with no trace left. Ted handled the ancient pope, aided by the magic web and the demon-slaying array. It was almost play. Ted even seized the pope's scepter, an item of powerful magic. A quick identification through the web revealed the artifact's name, the Rod of Debauchery. Ted stifled a laugh, shoved it away for study later, and put it safely beneath his robe. While Ted watched, Voldemort and Dumbledore struggled. At the same time, the outer battle was going as planned. Less than half the Death Eaters still stood, and many had lost their will to fight. Shouts of surrender rose from their ranks. "Stop! Stop! We're innocent! We were forced! Voldemort made us come," some cried. "I work for the Czech Ministry of Magic," others pleaded. "You can't kill me. My grandfather sits on the International Confederation." The defenders wavered. They were human. With so many begging for mercy, could they really annihilate them all? Ted cut through the hesitation and transmitted his voice across the formation, loud and unavoidable. "This formation won't hold for long. If we don't finish them now, our power will fade. If that happens, they'll regroup and support Voldemort." Moody and the others renewed their spells without hesitation, their attacks sharpening. Harry never ceased. While some Death Eaters begged for mercy, Bella was still berating the more defiant ones. And then, with a coordinated strike, Harry's palm and Neville's sword severed her head. Neville, answering Ted's telepathic cue, plunged the Gryffindor sword through Bella's mercury-like arm. In the inner circle, Voldemort felt one of his resurrection stones shatter. Surrounded by Ted's four, Voldemort snarled, "You can only kill me once. I am immortal." Snape, who had been silent until then, spoke coldly. "Lord Voldemort, there is no such thing as immortality in this world."